So just to start off with, thanks very much to the people who are joining us via WebEx and telehealth and in person. I'm Stephanie Stevenson. I'm the Executive Director of the BC Pediatric Society, and I'd like to welcome you all here. Next up will be Laura, who seems to be grasping for some papers, but she's just getting ready. All right, so Laura is going to start us off and we'll go from there. And thanks again for joining us.
Okay, so Jackie, are you up there? Yes, he is. Okay. So first of all, my name's Laura Dempsey, and can you hear me? Okay. Remote sites too? Yeah. Okay, great. Working with the BC Pediatric Society for the last few years, and it's been quite delightful. I should also mention that this seminar series, it's a series of 2 of continuing professional development, is sponsored by GSK. BC Pediatric Society put in a grant on the topic of vaccine communication, vaccine hesitancy, before we knew about the upcoming measles break or the current measles break. Imagine that. Of course, everything was developed independently, and we just sent in our objectives, and the rest is up to us. So here's what we're going to be talking about today, looking at some ideas about what might work best to introduce the topic of vaccines, practical tips for talking to parents and patients about vaccines, learning the latest evidence about vaccines and vaccine preventable diseases in British Columbia, and to be up to date with vaccine research in British Columbia.
Video's going, so that's good.
So this is one of the programs where I'm going to ask you to take out your phone or a tablet. And has everybody downloaded the app for Poll Everywhere? Okay, well, so first of all, to connect here, go to, if you're not on PHSA and you're not already connected, go to, I think it's BC Women's, and it's an open network. So go to that in your settings. How about the remote sites? Same thing for you if you haven't. And then you go to your app store.
Okay.
Find Poll Everywhere, P-O-L-L everywhere.
Oh, well.
And it'll ask you if you want to join a presentation. So after that, pollev.com/, you enter LAURAMOOREDE051. Forgot it? Put your hand up in this room if you're connected. Okay. Some are still getting connected. We'll just wait for a minute.
I know.
Just go back
One slide? Okay. Oops. No, it's all right. Previous. This is supposed to be the back one. Previous. Previous. It's not quite as previous. Okay, I think we'll move on. Could I also ask you to put your phones on vibrate or silent or whatever? Just because
Okay.
you're allowed to use them doesn't mean we want to hear any phone calls. So what we're going to do first is do a test of this audience response system. So here's the first question. So you either respond on the poll everywhere. My favorite season is. Okay, we've got 12 results, 13, 15. Okay, let's just show it. Show results. Oh, spring and summer wins it. All right, the next one. I have used an ARS audience response system before, or I have used ARS systems before. Okay, looks like we only are getting 15, so. Okay, well, that's interesting. So 70% yes, and a few have not. All right. Last test question. This was just to make sure everybody gets how to use them. So apparently that is happening. Have you ever used the poll everywhere audience response system, which is what you've just now got an app for? No, wow. I was hoping, because it's our first time too, to use this one, but Jackie knows everything about it, and I've got all the questions in that people sent, so we should be good to go. Couple of other things. Avon and Jane Finley are going to be the moderators for this evening. Do you want me to read your bios? I gave them all to you. So.
I don't have a bio.
Yes, you did. You gave it to me.
I could, no,
Okay, you do them. Okay, all right, that's fine. Then the other thing, okay, all right. I don't have anything for the people that are on the remotes, but here, I'm just going to give you some notebooks with the agenda in here, suggesting that maybe you might want to take notes tonight, maybe not. We don't have handouts of the PowerPoint slides. I will ask the speakers if they would be able to provide them in PDF format on the BC Pediatric Society website. This session is going to be recorded if the presenters consent to that. So that we'll let you know about later. But bring this to your desk and maybe it'll be another trigger to remind you on speaking and introducing the topic of immunizations with your patients and the parents when they come in. So I'll just pass these around and I'll turn it over to you too.
So we're gonna send it together.
Yeah, stand it together and then we're gonna do the pretest.
Oh, the pretest,
Yes.
right.
Oh, you can take whatever color you want.
This one, right?
Yes, it'll go with my
Yeah.
clothes.
Do I just?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to do the pretest. It's okay if you don't know. In fact, I hope you don't know, because if you know everything, what's the point of being here, right? Oh, that's not mine. That must be the first objectives. I don't have the pretest.
Jackie's doing that.
Okay.
Jackie?
Here he is, Jackie.
The pretest. Please.
That was the first presenter.
Yeah.
And I don't know how things are organized.
P-test. Okay. There you go. Right. This one. Is it this one?
You better, yeah.
Okay. Let's stay there.
And then First question. HPV vaccination encourages girls to be sexually active at an earlier age because after vaccination, they don't worry about contracting HPV. Oh, there it is. Okay. That was an easy one to start with, wasn't it? Vaccines. How do we get rid of this? Okay. Vaccines for which of the following antigens contain aluminum in one or more of the products used in BC? How many are there? 19. Okay, show results. Good. We're not giving you the answers now because you'll learn them tonight. The next one. Okay. Which of the following vaccines are contraindicated in individuals who have had anaphylaxis to egg? One more there. Okay. I assume we're showing the difference between the pre and the post at the end. What's the purpose of thimerosal in vaccines? You notice I'm not telling you the answers. Maybe I don't know them. And what are the key reasons underlying vaccine hesitancy? A lot of C's. Some expert at multiple choice questions made this one up. Good. The S in the acronym ASK. Among Canada's provinces, BC childhood immunization coverage is on par with national rates. One of the most important things, I didn't make this question, but it's true. One of the most important things that I as a pediatrician can do is to personally recommend vaccination for my patients. I like that one. My patient's parents have stated they do not want their infant vaccinated. The first thing I do is. Some really smart people here. A child whose historical immunization records cannot be retrieved should be. For assessment of immunization completeness, the date of vaccine administration and date of birth are required. Among Canada's provinces, BC has the highest rates of immunization coverage in children. Now you have to remember what you answered last time. Oh, yeah, that's back to the first one. So if we can go back to the
PowerPoint.
first PowerPoint, thanks. Thank you, everybody. Store your answers away. I can see that we're going to learn a lot about science and clinical aspects and motivational interviewing tonight. I'm going to learn a lot. So welcome. Our first speaker is Dr. Monica Naus from the BC Center.
Know who you are?
Oh, everybody knows me, don't they? I thought introduce you. Okay, we'll introduce each other. I thought Laura introduced me
Everyone
enough.
knows that Avon is the president of BC Pediatric Society. She's a respirologist, and as many of us who have subspecialties, also is involved in mental health.
Yeah, and general pediatrics. And
So, anything else you'd like to say?
I was going to introduce Jane. Jane
Okay.
Findlay is a pediatric infectious diseases specialist and who also does some general pediatrics and is
And mental health.
Yeah, and mental health. Works at the BC Family Immunization Clinic
Good,
as
good.
well, and she is the BC Pediatric Society liaison to the BC Immunization Committee.
Okay, great. So, carry on.
Okay, I didn't want to be introduced. Our first presentation tonight is Dr. Monica Naus, and she is going to be talking to us about opportunities to address the immunity gap at the healthcare encounter. Dr. Naus is a public health physician who has worked in communicable diseases, immunization, and vaccine preventable diseases at the provincial level in both Ontario and BC. She's currently the Medical Director for Communicable Diseases and Immunization Service and Medical Lead for Immunization and Vaccine Preventable Diseases at the BC Centre for Disease Control. Dr. Naus was a member of the Canadian National Advisory Committee on Immunization for 12 years and was its chair for 4 years, and continues to work on the task groups. She has been a member and former chair of the Canadian Immunization Committee since its creation in 2004. She has been engaged in operational, policy, and applied research in this area for over 25 years, and every aspect of public health immunization programs, from vaccine cold chain management to vaccine coverage assessment, monitoring of vaccine preventable diseases, management of outbreaks, and measles and rubella elimination. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Naus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending such a lovely evening indoors. and attending this session, and I hope it will be worthwhile for both of the group inside the room and the remote audience as well. And even though that's my title, I'm going to be covering a few of the objectives that are listed on a slide coming up. I do have a conflict of interest slide here. I noticed that everybody now says what their source of income is on their conflict of interest slide. So I'm a salaried physician employed by UBC through a grant tenure appointment funded by the BC Centre for Disease Control, which is a program of the Provincial Health Services Authority. And I have just consumed a dinner, presumably purchased by GSK, which I didn't put on this slide, but otherwise I have no affiliation with a commercial or other industry interest. At least it wasn't a luxurious dinner, so I feel, and it was here, not in Hawaii, so. And these are the objectives that I'd like to cover in my presentation today. Can everybody hear me? Okay. I just want to describe how childhood immunization is tracked in British Columbia and sources of information on your patient's immunization history, if that's not available to you. I think you're all aware of the implications of under-vaccination, but I just have some examples, recent examples, and also consider strategies that you can use to improve on-time immunization and vaccine series completion in your patient population. I know there's a couple of speakers after me this evening that will be talking more about how to have the conversation with patients. So I'm going to be talking about a slightly different aspect about how to improve uptake. I think most people in this room, I know a lot of pediatricians in this province don't do primary care pediatrics. So this immunization schedule may or may not look familiar to you, but this is what the immunization schedule in British Columbia looks like right now. And you can see that it is a busy schedule in that first year or two of life. And we were the first province and are still in the minority of provinces that are using a combination product called, I'm not supposed to use trade names, but it's called Infanrix Hexa. And we introduced that in British Columbia about a decade ago now because it does allow us to give that hepatitis B dose in a combination product. And not every province in this country has an infant hepatitis B program. In some jurisdictions, they still give hepatitis B only in adolescents. But Yukon and Quebec have recently introduced that same product as well. PCV 13, we were we were the second jurisdiction to go to a 2+1 schedule of PCV 13. Quebec is really the leader in Canada in trying to minimize the doses administered, and I think partly driven by frugality in that province. For any of you who have worked in Quebec and wheeled your own patients to the X-ray department and done your own urinalysis, they're very cost conscious. And then we started our MNC program in 2003, initially with a dose at 12 months, and then added a dose at 2 months of age. And we no longer give MNC in adolescents. We're in the third year of a quadrivalent meningococcal vaccine program, and that's given in grade 9 because the peak of nasopharyngeal carriage of meningococcus is in the late teens. And we see the bulk of group Y and now W disease in that 15 to 24 year age group. So placing that at grade 9 is probably the best position in terms of reducing that disease. We have a hepatitis A program just for Aboriginal children, both on and off reserve, and hopefully everybody here is aware of that. So any child under 19 years of age who's Aboriginal can be vaccinated against hepatitis A. And that was done because British Columbia had recurrent outbreaks of hepatitis A for which the epicenter was a First Nations community, not the same community, but the last big outbreak was Cowichan. And we actually, since introducing this program in 2012, we haven't had any outbreaks of hepatitis A in the province. And rotavirus, we've switched to a 3-dose program, and that happens to us because we're in various contracts. And sometimes when those contracts change over, we wind up getting a different product. And so at present, we're using the 2 for 6 months product. And then MMR and varicella, which are given at 12 months and at school entry, we use the combination product MMRV at school entry, but not at the first birthday because of the febrile seizure risk associated with that first dose. It's not sky high, but it is about 1 in 2,500 recipients, and we made a decision to use separate injection product. The Tdap IPV at school entry is a necessity of marketing of products in the country. So the big DPT IPV products are no longer marketed in Canada, and so all of the jurisdictions had to switch. And as you know, we've got a unisex program for HPV now, but boys were eligible only about 10 years after the girl program was started in 2008. And I've got some coverage information to show you on that. Just FYI, Quebec has decided to stop Tdap in adolescence. This is another sort of frugal measure, but also recognizing that the peak in pertussis, apart from early childhood, of course, is at 10 to 14 years of age, and older adolescents don't appear to experience pertussis at a particularly high rate. And so they're actually discontinuing that, and they're moving to just a single lifetime booster of TD in adults rather than recommending every 10 years. So the schedule is always changing. And in British Columbia, we have a couple of provider groups to keep up to date about immunization. Pharmacists, as you know, have been eligible to immunize for about a decade in this province. But for childhood immunization, especially early childhood immunization, it's really physicians in the Lower Mainland and in Victoria, and public health nurses elsewhere. We've got a mixed model of immunization services, and that presents some challenges in terms of trying to keep immunization records in one place or consolidated. We've had an immunization registry, so an electronic information system for tracking immunizations in the province since the 1990s, but it does require manual record retrieval from doctors' offices in places like Fraser Health, where they've done this since the beginning of time. So doctors have to write down on a piece of paper. If you work in Vancouver, you don't know about this probably, but in Fraser Health, that is routinely done. And the fact that a child exists is known to public health because they receive newborn records of birth, because a child might show up for public health services, because a physician reports that they've administered a vaccine, or once kids are enrolled through school enrollment data. And for a couple of years now, British Columbia has electronic school enrollment records coming into the registry about 4 times during the school year for the majority of schools in the province, not for every school. But again, that's an improvement on manual enrollment records, which is what we used to get. And in 2014, we introduced a system. For some reason, it's called Panorama. Nobody really knows why. It must have been a competition for best name. And this is what they came up with. And this is the multi-million-dollar system that was built for Canada Public Health post-SARS. It was supposed to solve all of our problems in public health, including things like contact management. But it does have an immunization registry, and we also use it for reporting of adverse events following immunization. Vancouver Coastal has never used Panorama. They did use, or parts of Vancouver Coastal used to use IFIS, but they use a system called Paris, which I think was purchased from Ireland many years ago. And Fraser Health is moving to Paris. Yes, they're moving to a different instance of Paris than the one that Vancouver Coastal uses, but they're going to be making that change later this year. I've mentioned the electronic school enrollment data. And one important thing is that the ministry has, let's just say, read the riot act to the regional health authorities that use non-panorama information systems. And by the end of, I would say, this calendar year, we should have data from Vancouver Coastal Health coming over into Panorama, plus Northern Health, where a locally developed system is in use in public health for a couple of years. They're electronically migrating their data into Panorama on a regular basis. And Fraser Health is also building an interface so that when they implement Paris later this summer, which is what they're expecting to do, they will have to export their data or upload their data regularly into the provincial immunization registry. So only Vancouver Island and Interior Health will be using a native instance of Panorama for all of their functions. And physicians in this province are not connected to that system right now. They are going to have access through a Care Connect viewer to the immunization records, but it won't allow them to exchange information, and it won't allow them to enter information or update a child's record. The plan is that that will be done with exchange of data with electronic medical records, of which there are about 5 systems in the province. I think TELUS and Wolf and a few others. And so that's being explored right now. And the plan is that that will eventually solve our problem of not having electronic access to physician immunization records. Now, this is my immunization record, and I didn't put it up here to show you how old I am. I was immunized in Czechoslovakia as a little kid, and I think I got this record when I was in medical school from my mother. And I looked at it and I said, holy smokes, what did I get when I was 3 days old? And I guess I had BCG. I didn't know that until then. And I'm not boasting that I have an immunization record, but, I think, our observation is that it is really a cultural norm, maybe of a different generation, to have maintained their immunization record as though it was your identity card or your passport. And that is something that we're trying to inculcate, but there is increasingly reliance, I think, by parents that somebody else has maintained their immunization record. I'm sure that you've observed that. But there are a couple of potential solutions to that. In British Columbia, there's this child health passport that is still produced and printed. And I think parents probably use it because they can track things like how big the kid is, right? They can, but people are always interested in knowing whether they're growing and doing the things that they're supposed to at various milestones. But it does have pages as well on which the child's immunization record is supposed to be recorded. Of those of you who do primary care pediatrics, do parents bring that in religiously when they come in for their immunizations? Because I think that's probably one problem, that maybe people don't bring their record with them to be updated, even though in theory they could go home and write it down or transcribe the information into their child's immunization record. But essentially, the source for the data that goes into the immunization registry is handheld records like this. And they're either parent-held records or they're information provided from the child's healthcare provider that they've been immunized, and this is the day, month, year that the child has received these vaccines. And there is a tool that's been available in Canada for a few years now that was developed out of Ontario Hospital's Research Institute. Kumanan Wilson is an internist who's behind this tool. And it unfortunately doesn't interface with provincial immunization registries, but it is a way for parents to keep their child's immunization record on their smartphone or their iPad or whatever. So it comes now in both flavors of either Android or Apple devices, and you can record your child's immunization there directly, presumably off a paper card or at the physician's office while your child is receiving those vaccines. I think it does a few things. It can connect in theory to things like alerts about outbreaks. I think that was the plan, so that, not that outbreaks happen that often, but you could get messages. It's like I don't know whether you've downloaded the Canada weather app. So if there's going, wind warning and we're going to have a heavy rain overnight. So if there's an outbreak, it will send those kinds of alerts, and potentially it can help you to be reminded about when your child needs to be vaccinated as well. Now, if a child doesn't have an immunization history in your information system, where do you go for that information? And I think that probably the children that are born within Canada and have moved within Canada to British Columbia are less of a problem, because either the parent will have a record or it will be retrievable from their previous healthcare provider, or if they resided in a jurisdiction where those records are collected, and most provinces in the country do have immunization registries for children, that record will be retrievable from the immunization registry in that jurisdiction. Usually you don't get it from the provincial level, but you would contact the local health unit where that child resided, and they would be able to send you what they have on that child, or the parent can retrieve it from the local health unit. And it would have to be done with the parent's consent anyway. And the pretest question that I think was pretty well answered, what to do with a child whose prior record cannot be retrieved. The advice from the Canadian Immunization Guide and NACI, and that's reflected also in the British Columbia Immunization Manual, is that you should assume that the child is unvaccinated and revaccinate them from scratch. And the older they are, the few doses they need, because it's only babies who need those larger numbers of doses. And after a certain age, you wouldn't be giving them vaccines like Hib or rotavirus or PCV13, for instance. And the rationale for this is twofold, but one is that adverse events, more serious adverse events, are not observed when you give extra doses to children for the vast majority of the vaccines that are given in childhood. The one proviso is tetanus, diphtheria containing vaccines. You can have a large local reaction, but as you know, even a child who's on a regular schedule can have a large local reaction at the 4th or 5th dose with tetanus, diphtheria containing vaccines. And if you have an older child who's had a whopping big reaction, then you can reassess that. But the issue really is that the opportunity for serological testing for immunity is largely not there for most of these diseases through any labs that you would have access to, like either Life Labs or the BCCDC lab. So just a simple example, for MMR and MMR varicella, for mumps, there's no serological correlate of protection. So there's no point trying to test somebody for mumps immunity because it's not going to tell you anything. For varicella, the vaccine-induced immunity is generally not considered to be reliably detectable by commercially available anti-varicella antibody tests. So there's not a reason to be testing individuals. So even if you tested them for measles and rubella immunity, you're still not going to have an answer on those other two. And because we don't have individual antigen vaccines, you're going to have to give them MMR or MMRV. So the advice is just to proceed. Just focus your attention on the right column. This is just a table from our report available online at the bccdc.ca for the most recent year for 2-year-olds in the province based on registry data. And these data don't include Vancouver Coastal Health because they don't participate in the registry, and they also don't collect records on children this young. Vancouver Coastal has a process of collection of records at kindergarten entry. And then after that, that information is in their immunization registry. But the statistics that we run here, so this is on a census population, it's not a sample. are up to date for age, which means by the age of 2, it includes everything up to and including the 18-month booster. So only 74% of children are fully up to date, and a proportion of that, you'll see 81% are up to date except for their 18-month booster dose. So a good chunk of that is missing the 18-month dose. When we've taken a look at timeliness of vaccination, children tend to be on time for 2, 4, 6-month doses. It's not too bad at 12 months, but it's at 18 months where the mom's gone back to work that things really drop off. And so that, I think, is very important to consider, because that's where parents need to be supported with things like reminders and recalls, because they don't tend to make it in on time for those doses. And then we also look at the data by specific antigens or antigen groupings. And you can see that for some of them, for hepatitis B, for example, we're at 86%. For MMR, we're at 87% at the second birthday. That's 1 dose completion, because our second dose is given at school entry. For chickenpox, very similar. For meningococcal C conjugate, 87%, and so on. In the last few years, we've also started reporting on the percent of children who are in the registry who have an active record, but on whom no immunizations are recorded at all, and that's 6%. So I think that some of the low rates are artifact, because there's not a record on those children. And even though the proposed mandatory documentation regulation that you've all heard about, that the minister plans to introduce in time for September, won't affect 2-year-olds because it'll be a school entry law, it should at least help clean up some of this portion of children on whom we really don't have documents and we don't know what their status is, even though probably, but not certainly, their status might be similar to what it is for the other children. And then 2% of children in the province have refused all vaccines. And that's a pretty high percentage for at a provincial level. Usually it's in the order of 0.3%. So, but it's not 10 or 15, but it is and of course it varies by geography, and I'll show you some of that on these slides. Last year we launched a tool called the Childhood Immunization Coverage Dashboard. So you can go on our website and you can select any one of those parameters that I just showed you. You can select a year and you'll be able to see what the provincial coverage is, and you'll also be able to take a look at what the numbers look like at the health service delivery area level. And we've got 16 of those health service delivery areas in the province, and here they're color coded by regional health authority. So depending on where you work, the coverage might be higher or lower. And what we've seen, and this is I know that everybody's focused on measles right now, so this is H7 measles on this slide as well. And what you'll see is that Richmond has the highest. This is because Jane, right? You live there. But the interesting thing is that in the first years of our HPV vaccine program, we also found that the HPV vaccine uptake rates were the highest in Richmond, and they consistently have had the highest uptake rates. And one would like to think that it's because the health department there is doing an excellent job, but you probably realize that to some extent this is about the underlying populations in those areas, who lives there and how positively inclined they are towards vaccination. And so our at least based on this information, you can see that the areas with the lower vaccine uptake are in interior health and some parts of the north as well. And when you go at a lower level than that, and we are in the process of developing mapping, we've done some of that already on a trial basis with our health authorities, and both Vancouver Coastal and Fraser have developed maps and are using that to inform programming and specific outreach and efforts to improve uptake in populations. When you look at the uptake at the neighborhood level, we definitely have subpopulations with very low vaccine coverage. And our pockets are especially along the Gulf Coast, so the Gulf Islands, places like Hornby and so on, Sunshine Coast, and also Fraser East, where we've got our religious, faith-based objectors to vaccination and our biggest outbreak of measles in, I guess, the last 20 years or so. And so Vancouver Coastal has also started since the 2014 measles outbreak. They were motivated to put their school coverage data online. And so if you go to this link, you'll be able to look up school vaccine uptake rates in Vancouver Coastal, school by school, and you can choose any parameter that you want. In this case, it's a kindergarten measles, and I chose a particularly low coverage school on the Sunshine Coast within their data set. So you can take a look at your neighborhood schools and see whether there's an opportunity for you to invite yourself to come and talk to a parent advisory committee about immunization, offer your services. In British Columbia, I mentioned that we've also introduced an HPV program for boys. And on this slide, at the top are the uptake rates at the health service delivery area for girls. And in the bottom set, it's for boys. And you can see that by and large, the patterns are reflective of one another. So in high boy uptake areas, there's high uptake in girls. They very much follow these patterns. And this is a stacked bar chart. In the orange or yellow is the segment of the population that received only one dose of HPV vaccine but didn't complete their series by the end of the school year. And this is a population on which we can intervene in order to improve the uptake rates, because clearly there wasn't a refusal of vaccination, there just wasn't a series completion. And oftentimes these kids can complete that series, receive their next dose in their family doctor's office. Many of them, I think, probably won't be going to a pediatrician, but they could be immunized at a pharmacy or another type of setting like that. They can also come into the health unit to be vaccinated. So there's a variety of options, but our uptake rates would be better if those kids received their second dose, obviously, because we assess series completion. Now, implications of non-vaccination and under-vaccination. I guess the most florid example, and I have to say it was a small outbreak of measles that received a huge amount of media attention. But this is what 2019 measles in British Columbia looks like. And so because measles is considered eliminated in the Pan American Health Organization region, all of our cases are classified as either imported or import associated. We no longer have endemic measles. And so you can see we've had a number of importations. And so far this year, all of our importations have been either from the Philippines, from Vietnam, or from the United States. And the United States was not Clark County, but just a little bit south of there. And it was actually a visitor from Chicago. The outbreak that got a lot of attention is shown in blue. So the 3 January to early February cases, so a number of confirmed cases are along the y-axis, and the week of rash onset, so it's basically an epidemic curve. And the 3 dark blue cases at the beginning were the ones who received a lot of press. The father spoke to the newspaper. This was the family with 3 unvaccinated boys who traveled to Vietnam for a holiday in January and then returned to British Columbia. One of the boys was already ill while returning, and the other 2 may have acquired it from their brother, or perhaps they were infected in Vietnam as well. And they attended several French language schools in Vancouver. And there was transmission within the school with further, not a large number of cases in the school, but also transmission in, I think here at BC Children's Emergency Room, as well as households. So some siblings became ill as well. And yesterday was day 21 after the rash onset in the last case. So in theory, that outbreak is over unless there's a case that was not reported. And so this is the sort of implication of non-vaccination. Sometimes I think it's important to realize that individuals may not realize that they weren't vaccinated. It's not clear to me that the family was fully conscious about this earlier decision that had been made, because they said that they had worried about autism and a measles vaccine, and that was the reason they gave for not having vaccinated their children a decade ago. And it's not really clear whether there were any failures in the system. They said they went to a travel clinic, but it's hard to believe that they wouldn't have been offered MMR prior to travel if that had been the case. So there are community implications and widespread implications apart from just the individual risk of becoming infected when you travel overseas. And with measles, that's a big risk, because since 2010, there really has been a large resurgence of measles in places where you wouldn't have ordinarily expected measles to be occurring, including many European countries, even though all of our importation so far appears to have been from Asia. So other scenarios with respect to the risk of under-vaccination or non-vaccination, I just want to give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we do see, not in large numbers, but we do see on a regular basis, are children who should have received 23-valent polysaccharide vaccine in addition to the conjugate vaccine, and who develop invasive disease due to a serotype that's covered by the 23-valent vaccine, but is not in the PCV13 vaccine. And while we've not done a lot of work in this area, I think the issue, as I mentioned, is that we do have a variety of immunization service providers. We do have this mixed model, and oftentimes a child with, say, severe cerebral palsy or neurological disorders or chronic heart or lung disease may be under the care of a specialty physician, but are not seeing their primary care practitioner, and maybe that communication isn't quite happening to prod them to ensure that the child gets vaccinated. And I think that's one of the things that Manish is trying to close the loop on here at Children's Hospital, so that when these children come in for their outpatient visits to specialty outpatient services, they can be vaccinated at the family immunization clinic before they go home, so that the opportunity to offer them that vaccine is not missed. At a program level and a public health control level, one of the gaps in our system around under-vaccination or lack of records is that when we have a single case of measles in a school, we can be facing a scenario as occurred in November of last year, when a 16-year-old traveled to Asia, returned back, had measles, went back to her high school, and 400 students in that high school did not have an immunization record available to public health, where all of a sudden the health department was having to exclude 400 students from school because there was no proof available that they had been immunized and were immune. So again, I think that while our government is probably not going to move into a mandatory vaccination legislation, the mandatory documentation of immunization status should help us deal with problems like this. Now I'm going to turn to strategies that you can use in the office to improve vaccine uptake rates. And I don't know how many of you read Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I do. I have, and so this is based on their cartoons. But effective strategies, over and over, reminders and recalls. So we often joke that you get more reminders and recalls from your veterinarian for your dog's visits than we do from our family doctor for our immunization visits. So reminders and recalls by phone, by postcard, by letter, maybe by text message, or email are all effective and have been demonstrated to be effective over and over again in improving uptake of patient populations. Another question, do you have parents book appointments for their infants or toddlers at the time of their current appointment to ensure on-time immunization, just like you might book a haircut every 8 weeks? The nurse that I work with does that. She books her haircut appointment at her current haircut appointment. And I know that in public health, for example, one of the challenges and one of the efforts in the last 10 years has been to reduce the wait time to the next appointment, because when parents do call for an appointment and their child is due, say, next week, they can't get an appointment for another 3 or 4 weeks because the clinic is fully booked. So this kind of advanced thinking and booking those appointments at the time that the child is there for their 2-month, 4-month, even their 6-month visits is probably a good idea. In the pretest, you were already asked, do you make your recommendations to vaccinate strong and clear? A recommendation from a trusted healthcare provider over and over has been shown to be the strongest predictor of whether a person chooses to vaccinate their children. Do you recommend to parents to sign up for a reminder on our website, Immunize BC, or to use the Can Immunize app to keep track of their child's immunization? So tools that parents themselves can use in order to stay on top of their kids' vaccinations. Do you use every encounter as an opportunity to immunize? So just because the child is here for another reason doesn't mean that you can't check their immunization record and offer them or recommend. If you're a pediatrician and you're not actually immunizing, you're still influential in prompting them to get vaccinated if they're not up to date. Another sort of a provocative question here is, do you discuss immunization with kids whose parents have previously declined vaccines on their behalf? Under mature minor legislation, there's no magic age at which a child is deemed to be competent to consent on their own behalf, but in practice, around 11, 12 years of age, and in practice at grade 9 in British Columbia, those children are asked to consent on their own behalf. So perhaps that's a conversation worth having as well. Do you use opportunities like the measles outbreak to call in under-vaccinated kids or unvaccinated kids for their MMR or MMRV proactively? And another sort of science-based finding, evidence-based finding, is that the use of personal stories about your own experience with patients who've had vaccine-preventable diseases, or the reason why you vaccinated your own children, can have more meaning to a parent than presenting them with a bunch of statistics. So using anecdotal information, and I guess we're all raised from an oral tradition of stories. Stories have more impact than mere statistics. I also recently heard a presentation by an internist in the United States who's very active in immunization, who had a number of strategies around how to engage the entire office in improving immunization uptake among patients. And what he said, and his name is Robert Hopkins in Little Rock, Arkansas. He's chair of the National Vaccine Advisory Committee in the United States. And he says immunization is a team sport. You should engage all of your office staff, make sure that they all have a basic understanding of the benefits of immunization and why it's important, and that they all have discrete roles in making sure that the patient population in that office gets vaccinated, that they have a positive approach to vaccination, that the fridge is never empty of vaccines, and that ideally trying to improve the uptake of vaccines in your patient population should be done as a quality improvement initiative, because it's a repetitive, standardized procedure, and it lends itself very well. You set a goal, you do a survey of your charts, you figure out where you're at, how many kids are missing vaccines, you have a plan to improve that by at least, say, 50%, and then you put in a plan and you assess how you're doing against that plan. So there's a link to his presentation there on this page. And then finally, I'll just wrap up that we've got a lot of good resources for physicians, both, on our website, it's under the health professions channel, and there's a couple of really great infographics that will take you to various sections of information, whether it's vaccine safety, immunization communication, clinical guidelines like the immunization manual. And we also maintain a website for the public, which is a hot pink with measles right now in the lower right corner here, called immunizebc.ca. And that's a website that's gotten a lot of kudos and has a lot of great information, including helping parents figure out where the nearest health unit is by typing in their postal code. And that is my final slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one question. Any questions? Any from the remote sites? Okay. Thank you very much. I think there will be questions, but people can address those later. Okay. Should I close this one? Jackie, you better come and do it because I'll do something wrong while I introduce the next speaker.
And we call the steam fan already.
Yeah.
Just trying to see here.
Someone was like washing the floor.
Our next speaker is Dr. Manish Sadaran. Sorry, I did practice Sadarangani, who is going to tell us what's in a vaccine, which is really important information because parents come to us with all sorts of questions about this horrible stuff in the vaccines that's going to poison my child. Manish is a director of the Vaccine Evaluation Center at BCCH Research Institute and an assistant professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases, UBC Department of Pediatrics. He completed his undergraduate medical training and residency in Cambridge, Oxford, and London. And then he completed his PhD with the Oxford Vaccine Group in the UK, developing novel vaccine candidates for protection against capsular group B meningococcal disease. Sounds good. There.
The hair.
Maybe
nice.
point. Yeah, that's right. How am I going to control my hair in the fan? I don't know.
In Vancouver, and then he went back to Oxford to work as a pediatric infectious diseases physician. But it looks like he's here again. He's worked in
fine.
pediatrics through all over the world.
Yes.
So,
Start. Yeah.
welcome. Thank you.
No worries. So I was kind of asked to talk about what's in a vaccine and also talk about the work that we're doing at the Vaccine Evaluation Center. So I kind of played around a bit with the title. Those are my disclosures, and yeah, that's what it is. So these are the learning objectives that I was given. Actually, so for you guys to understand the purpose of the different components of routinely used vaccines in Canada, and it's focused specifically on the products that we use in BC, and then also to appreciate the role of the Vaccine Evaluation Center in vaccine research. So these are all the different components of vaccines, and I'll go through them sort of one by one, but essentially you have the immunogens, which are the antigens, which we're probably most familiar with, and we spend most of our time talking about, which are responsible for protective immunity. The adjuvants, which are there to enhance the response to the antigens because in themselves they're not usually very good. The various preservatives that are put in to prevent contamination and prolong the shelf life of the products. Antibiotics, which are used mainly to prevent contamination during viral cell culture. Various growth promoters, which are used to help grow the viruses in the various vaccines. Formaldehyde for the inactivated vaccines. And then different stabilizers that are there, which increase the manufacturing efficiency process and ultimately reduce the cost. So these are all the different vaccines available in BC. The last time I looked, and this is based by antigen. And I'm not going to go through them all one by one, but to highlight the red ones, which are the live ones. So there's the influenza flu mist product that we use in children, the MMR and varicella and MMRV, various combinations, and rotavirus vaccines. So let's just briefly on the immunogens. So we have the live attenuated vaccines. So these are just examples. So the measles, mumps, rubella, and varicella components, where the actual amount of antigen in the vaccine is relatively small. Because then these are, while they're attenuated, they're replication competent viruses, and so they then replicate. And it's only once they replicate that increases the antigen load, and then you get the actual immune response, which is why we see some of the adverse events like the rash that you can get after a measles vaccine that comes on several days afterwards. It's not immediately at the time, because this replication has to take place first. Then we've got the killed whole organism vaccines, such as polio and inactivated influenza, where you've got the whole pathogen which has been inactivated in whatever way, usually through formaldehyde, but it has all the components of the original pathogen in there. And then a lot of the vaccines, and increasingly, particularly the more recently developed ones, are organism components. So we've got the toxoid vaccines, such as tetanus and diphtheria, the acellular pertussis vaccine, which is based on proteins from the pertussis bacteria, hepatitis B, which is just a single protein, which is the hep B surface antigen, HPV vaccine, which just contains, again, a single protein, which is the L1 protein from the different HPV types, and the conjugate vaccines, which are all based around the polysaccharide of the different bacteria that we vaccinate against, and they're conjugated to a protein, tetanus, diphtheria based usually. So those are the immunogens in themselves, and so they have to be there, and I think most people understand why they're there, and that's not usually what we spend most of our time talking to our patients about who want to talk about what's in a vaccine. It's the other stuff. So let's look at the adjuvants first. So a lot of them are aluminum based, and there's various flavors that aluminum comes in, and you don't need to know all of them, but there's a lot of different types. And they're in a lot of the vaccines that we use. So all of the diphtheria tetanus containing vaccines contain aluminum. All of the hepatitis A and B vaccines that we use contain aluminum. The HPV vaccines contain aluminum. All of the meningococcal vaccines, apart from the quadrivalent ones, so the Men-B, Men-C vaccines all have it, and Prevnar 13 also has it. So none of the live vaccines have it, but most of the others do. And this has been used in vaccines for a very, very long time. So it was first discovered in 1926. More than 1 billion vaccine doses have been given, which contain aluminum around the world. It varies a little bit from product to product, as in how much aluminum is in there, but it's anything between 0.1 and 1.5 milligrams per dose. And by comparison, this is in the first 6 months of life, the exposure of aluminum from feeding. So breastfeeding is around 7 milligrams, formula feeding 38 milligrams, and those people who are on soy formula, it's 117 milligrams. Although accepting that clearly the one we give in the vaccine is injected, and the ones that are going in through feeding are orally absorbed. And so there was this interesting study done a few years ago by a group at the CDC in the US, where they essentially looked at the safe levels of aluminum from years of literature and how much goes in over the first year or so of a child's life. And so across the x-axis at the bottom here, it shows days of life. And then this is the total body burden of aluminum in milligrams that you expect. And this is based on, while there's some modeling, it's based on real measurements. And so the first thing is just to look at the blue line, and that is what is regarded as a safe level of aluminum in a standard, healthy 50th centile term baby. And so as you can see over the first year of life, your sort of safe level goes up, and you can tolerate more. The red line, then the next one, is for a low birth weight baby. So this is for a baby on the 5th centile. So what they're deemed to be safe is slightly less than a normal birth weight baby. And then on the bottom here, I'll go right to the bottom first. These two lines, the green and the yellow line, are how much you gain from feeds, so from formula feeding and from breast milk feeding. And you can see that it's sort of this gradual increase, but it doesn't even reach 1 milligram in terms of your total body burden of aluminum. And then that gray line is how much you get from vaccines if you receive all the routine vaccines in the United States schedule back when the study was done in 2011. And you can see while there's a gradual increase, there are these little blips which sometimes doesn't fully show up on the images around the time of the 2, 4, 6 month doses, and then there's another little blip here around 12 months. where you get these small peaks, and you don't get massive peaks because it actually forms like a depot preparation in the muscle, and so it's actually gradually absorbed into the system. But you can see the gap, and that's shaded in pink, which is the gap between how much you're receiving from the vaccine and how much is deemed safe, even for a low birth weight baby. And there's a huge margin there in terms of safety. Having said that, adverse reactions do occur. We certainly see them in our clinic. I'm sure many of you have seen them in your experience. Often erythema, you can have subcutaneous nodules, particularly if the intramuscular vaccines are accidentally injected into the subcutaneous space, but there have been some nice studies with contrast showing that even an intramuscular injection, you can get very, very small amounts of fluid going into the subcutaneous tissue space. And some people are extremely sensitive to it. And I think you have to accept that we'll see these. And we've certainly seen children with sterile abscesses that occasionally have needed to go to surgery to have those removed, we presume as a result of the aluminum. And you see contact hypersensitivity and granulomatous inflammation. So overall, it's extremely safe, and these rare adverse reactions do occur. And when they occur, you can usually deal with them. And we usually actually would re-immunize, and I think there's one child that I've seen that ended up with recurrent sterile abscesses from the aluminum, which we then had to have long discussions with, but that's extremely exceptional. So other adjuvants, and I just want to talk about these two vaccines, which have got some of these newer adjuvants, these ASO adjuvants. So Cervarix, which we don't use in BC anymore routinely, has got aluminum hydroxide, but also MPL, and I won't go through the full name, but essentially it's a mild version of endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide. So it is designed to be potent, and it is there to give the immune system a bit of a kick to respond better to the HPV vaccine. And then more recently, a slightly different ASO based adjuvant in the Shingrix vaccine, which as pediatricians, we don't usually think about so much for our patients, but as I approach this sort of age, I'm starting to think about it more for myself. And so this also contains MPL, and then also it contains an extract from this Quiaja saponaria plant, which is a soapbark tree, which is in the picture there. So essentially, it's an extract from soap, which is contained in this adjuvant. And just because it's one of the newer products, I just thought I'd show you some of the data from the clinical trials that were done, the phase 3 trials from this vaccine. So this was the first trial that was published called Zoe50 in adults aged 50 years and older. And you can see that this is reactogenic. Over 80% of people reporting a local injection site reaction, most of which is pain. And 2/3 reporting some sort of systemic reaction, mostly myalgia, fatigue, and headaches. But if you look down, 20%, so 1 in 5 adults receiving this vaccine have a fever, and that's really unusual for any vaccine in adults, actually. So this is an extremely reactogenic vaccine, but also very immunogenic. So kind of take the rough with the smooth. And then the other study that was done with that in the older population, over 70, again, it's similar. So almost 75% of adults experiencing a significant injection site reaction, and then over a half having some sort of systemic reaction. And that is almost, we think, entirely due to the adjuvant. And we've recently just finished a study that we're hoping to publish that I did when I was in Oxford, looking at the MenB vaccine at Bexsero, and done some work in a mouse model showing that the reactogenicity of that is almost entirely down to the OMV component of that vaccine. And that is probably the LPS in the OMV, even though there's very little in there. So you don't need much in there, but that's what it is. So that's the adjuvant. So they're there. They are generally very, very safe. But they're there for a reason. So antibiotics, again, this is kind of an easier thing to deal with because, if you have an allergy, then you obviously have to avoid these vaccines. And I'm not going to go again into the details of each one, but these are the different antibiotics that are in different vaccines. So lots of vaccines contain neomycin, which we don't use really clinically very much, so it's not an issue. Some vaccines contain polymyxin V, some contain streptomycin, a couple of the flu vaccines have gentamicin, and then one vaccine contains kanamycin. So again, it's just something to be aware of. And then just looking at some of the preservatives which are there to prevent contamination, prolong the shelf life, and some of these other various growth promoters that are used. So again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these in detail. I've picked out 2 or 3 that we often end up having to discuss. So lots of the vaccines contain polysorbate 80, some contain bovine serum albumin, there's some that have latex, a few, mostly the hepatitis B vaccines that contain yeast protein, but the HPV vaccine also contains some yeast protein. There's several vaccines that contain egg protein or ovalbumin. There's some of the flu vaccines which contain thimerosal, some that contain gelatin, and actually the live attenuated flu vaccine contains, I should say, porcine gelatin. And then others have various, so there's arginine in the live attenuated flu vaccine. One of the flu vaccines contains chicken protein. I have no idea why it's there, but clearly it's obviously doing something useful. And then MMR contains phenol red, which is also listed as an allergen. So yeast protein. So according to Wikipedia, which as we know is the source of all truth, it is instrumental to winemaking, baking, and brewing since ancient times. And those of you who are involved in any of these activities are probably more familiar with yeast than I am. So hepatitis B surface antigen in the vaccines is produced in yeast cells. It's produced in Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and so a tiny quantity of proteins from the yeast may remain in the vaccines. And there's clearly quality control purposes, and there's a maximum amount that has to be that can be in the vaccine before it's released for use. But there may be small quantities in there, and as far as I know, there's never been any evidence of any allergic reactions to the amount of yeast protein that is in the hepatitis B vaccine. Egg protein. So this is an ongoing discussion, and we still get lots of referrals and questions around this. So vaccine viruses for some of the vaccines are grown in fertilized hen's eggs. And so again, a small amount of egg protein does remain in these vaccines. And these are the ones here that are those egg-containing vaccines. So there's MMR containing influenza vaccines. We now have very, very large body of safety data and very clear guidance in Canada and the US and other countries that it's safe to give these vaccines in the community as you would normally, even to the most severe egg allergic children and adults. And there's been now a number of studies done in the last few years around flu vaccine. So for the trivalent inactivated flu vaccine, and as far as we can think, it should be the same for the quadrivalent, over 5,000 doses, and after this season it'll be even more than that, have been given to over 4,500 patients, including 650 doses to those with very severe allergies, and there's been 0 severe allergic reactions. There have been some mild ones, no severe ones. The live attenuated flu vaccine, which was used more cautiously in egg allergic children when it was first licensed, now over 1,200 doses have been given to children with egg allergy, again with no allergic reactions, and those are all in actual studies. And in post-marketing surveillance, there's been no evidence of increased risk of allergic reactions. So essentially, MMR-containing vaccines, flu vaccines, are all completely safe, even in the most severe cases of egg allergy, including anaphylaxis. Yellow fever vaccine is a bit more challenging. I think the reactions are more significant, and this then comes down to an individual risk-benefit based on how severe was the egg, how severe is the egg allergy, and how much do you really need the yellow fever vaccine. And depending on where you go. And certainly with yellow fever, I just saw a patient in clinic not that long ago, not for egg allergy, but for other reasons, couldn't have yellow fever vaccine and child who was going traveling in East Africa that I wrote a waiver letter for so she could get through immigration, etc., and not have any issues. So I think that's a very difficult thing. And even for that, I usually end up, you'll ask these questions that every patient is slightly different. There's not that many, and so I usually in the sort of phone a friend situation. So I'll reach out to other colleagues within BC from public health, and then we have through our immunization network across Canada, I'll sort of ping emails around saying, "Oh, I've got this child, and what would people do?" And then for this, actually, there's an adult ID physician who's based in the UK at UCL, who is essentially in the UK regarded as sort of the world expert in yellow fever vaccines and anything to do with them. And so I actually emailed him for that patient recently as well. And it's really, I think when you don't know, you have to phone a friend. Thimerosal, so that's the other one which we get asked about a lot. So it's a mercury-based preservative. It contains a form of mercury called ethyl mercury. It's very useful for multi-dose vials because it does enable you to antigen sparing. So that means you can use less antigen in each dose, which means that a specific amount of protein, for example, will go further in a vaccine, which is very useful for pandemic vaccines in particular. And so thimerosal get used quite a lot in there, and it also prevents contamination and therefore prolongs the shelf life. So it's only found now in some flu vaccines. There's no evidence of harm. There's no link with autism, which is something that has been mentioned by some anti-vaccine people. But it is being reduced because there's a general push by regulators to remove thimerosal from vaccines as part of a global effort to reduce mercury exposure, and as part of a real push. They've really been pushing the companies in the last few years, particularly to really demonstrate why you need all these different components. And if you can't show a good reason why you need something in there, they really want it to come out. Having said that, the mercury exposure that is toxic is methyl mercury. So it's actually, even though there is this general trend, it's a completely different form of mercury anyway. And just again, some data around thimerosal. And so this shows the blood and stool mercury levels of newborns, 2-month-olds and 6-month-olds after they've been vaccinated. So as you go along here, this goes up to 30 days after vaccination. And then the red line shows the level of mercury. And this axis here, in case you can't read it, is in nanograms per mil. So in a newborn who's received a vaccination, they'll get up to about 5.5 nanograms per mil, and then it rapidly comes down. In a 2-month-old, it gets up to about 4, and in a 6-month-old, it gets up to about 3 nanograms per mil and rapidly decreases with some prolonged excretion in the stool. The safe level, no one truly knows what a safe level is for a healthy 3-kilogram infant, based on extrapolation from older children, adults, and animal data. We think it's around 300 nanograms per mil. So this is well below what is considered to be safe. And the average dentist is wandering around with 15 nanograms per mil of mercury in their blood anyway, just from the exposure they get through their work. So you're still way below those sorts of levels. So formaldehyde. Again, this is in a lot of the different inactivated vaccines highlighted here in orange, and it is needed to inactivate toxins from bacteria and viruses, particularly for the whole organism inactivated vaccines. It breaks down quickly in water, which is a major component of a lot of vaccines, and it is produced during normal metabolism. So there's less than 0.1 milligrams per dose of formaldehyde in any vaccine. The average 2-month-old has just over a milligram of formaldehyde in their bloodstream anyway, and pears have 50 times more formaldehyde than any vaccine. So again, although one is eaten and one is injected, that's still a huge difference in the amount of formaldehyde you're getting. I think Jane has a list of other fruits that contain large amounts of formaldehyde that she was telling me about. So some of these other things, I'm not going to go through sort of individually in detail. As Laura mentioned at the beginning, I'm happy to have the slides to be shared, but this is kind of another presentation where I did have all of it, and so you can see that if you go through each vaccine, there are lots of other different components, none of which are thought to be significant allergens or significant. None of these are really significant issues that come up, but if it's all there, and if you go onto the BCCDC website and have a look at your product of choice, everything is listed. So you can have a look or go into the product monograph, everything is there that's listed. And sometimes, with patients, I get to that point where I'm on the website with them, downloading the product monograph and going through each and every single ingredient, and it is what it is. And just again, for sort of added reassurance, I think hopefully this is not needed for you guys for reassurance, but there is a very long process before a vaccine even gets anywhere near any patient. So there's all the various lab studies that have to happen. There's extensive preclinical studies, including immunogenicity and toxicology testing in animals, which may start from small mammals such as mice, but eventually gets into, at the very least, sort of the rabbits and sort of large mammals, if not non-human primates. And then phase 1 studies in tens of people, phase 2 studies in tens to hundreds, and then the large phase 3 trials in hundreds to thousands before it gets anywhere near Health Canada. And then it goes to the Biologics and Genetics Therapies Directorate for review. And when they review it, they look at the product monograph, they look at the information that's in there for health professionals, They look at the scientific information and the data that's put into the product monograph and all the information that's there for consumers to make sure it's, in theory, worded appropriately. They inspect the facilities where the vaccines are manufactured, and they do independent lab analysis of vaccines as well before things are approved. So this is a very, very long process, and it's pretty robust, I would say. So now to just change tack slightly, I was asked to talk a bit about the Vaccine Evaluation Center. And so this is in my head what we do and what it looks like. And so this, to me, this is kind of the cycle of what a vaccine goes through in its life cycle, really. So you start off up here with some epidemiology, you identify the need for a vaccine. There's a preclinical discovery, the development phase through to phase 1 trials, the clinical studies, and then there's implementation, policy implementation studies, social science, vaccine uptake studies, and then goes back again because then you have to do surveillance to see if your implementation has made a difference. And the research we do really covers all of these different aspects of vaccines, and I will talk through each of these with some specific examples. So just to mention the people involved, so David Shifley founded the Vaccine Evaluation Center now just over 30 years ago in 1988, when, from what I've been told, it was a little porter cabin stuck somewhere in the middle of a field. He's now retired, but still sort of loiters around in his emeritus professor. And as he says, he now has the luxury of choosing what he wants to do rather than being told by other people what he should be doing, and is still very, very, very grateful. I'm very grateful for his ongoing presence and his wisdom. Simon Dobson, who was very integral in a lot of the work that has been done at the VEC, who found pastures new in Qatar to his delight, and he left us. Was it about a year ago now? Yes, I still remember coming back from a very nice winter break to an email, which I regret even opening my emails on a Sunday after coming back from holiday, saying we're having an emergency meeting in, where was it? It was in Beercraft or somewhere on a Sunday evening. You must attend. I was like, this is very bizarre for our division to do things like this. But anyway, and that was for me to be told that Simon was going to be leaving in 4 weeks. So he left on very rapidly, and we miss him. But he's still very involved actually in some of the HPV studies that we do. Toby Coleman has really been leading a lot of the understanding vaccine immunity and the immunologic studies that we do, and he's also leaving. It's a recurring theme here. So he's leaving, or he's left as of 3 days ago officially, to go to Perth in Western Australia to start as a group there with the Telethon Kids Institute. Soren Gant is here, and he's now head of the infectious disease division here at Children's, and does a lot of work really in all of these areas around understanding vaccine immunity, development. He runs some phase 1 trials and is also involved in various phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. And then Julie Bettinger really does a lot of work both in vaccine safety and then also around social sciences and vaccine hesitancy, and she will be coming to speak to you next week. So I'm going to talk a bit, so the epidemiology and surveillance, and really the impact is the jewel in the crown of this piece. It was this network set up across Canada. It was co-founded by David in 1991. Julie is currently head of the data center, which is housed here at the VEC, and myself and Laura Sauvé are the investigators for BC Children's Hospital. And we conduct national sentinel surveillance across 12 tertiary care pediatric hospitals in Canada. We have over 25 years of data on various vaccine preventable diseases before and after vaccine implementation, and also adverse events following immunization, and there's been over 70 publications from the network. So some examples of this, and just to highlight the real range of work that we do. So we do surveillance on pertussis. There's been some of the original Hib studies when there was still lots of Hib around, showing the impact of vaccines. There's a study we did looking at showing really the impact of the MenC vaccine in Canada after it was implemented, and sort of Monica alluded to the different provincial schedules that we have, which I think a lot of people don't like, and really the bane, and no one really understands it, but it's great for research because you have a sort of natural case control study where you can compare different programs, and you can see whether one works better than others or not. And then also this pneumococcal analysis that was done by Julie and David a few years ago. And then I just picked out one study because it was the most recent impact study that we published from some work that was done here, looking at pertussis in Canada over the last 16 years. And this is just one of the figures from the study, which shows from 1999 to 2015, the hospitalization rate for pertussis in infants under 12 months of age. And this grey line. And while there's some sort of fluctuation, which you get, which is the natural cycling of the disease, the grey line, which is the highest incidence, is in the under 2-month-olds, and then this blue line, which is closely following it, is in the 2 to 3 months olds. And you can still see a lot of disease in this younger age group. And while there's been this general trend down, there's still a significant amount of disease there. And as most of you will be aware, NACI recommended immunization in pregnancy against pertussis for all women last year, and I think a publicly funded program has been implemented in most provinces now, and hopefully will be in BC soon. As a result of this study, we also found these huge risk factors for poor outcomes in young children. So children under 16 weeks of age had a 5 times increased risk of going to ICU than older children, and children under 4 weeks had a over 6 times increased risk of dying than older children. And interestingly, girls had a almost 4 times higher risk of dying than boys, which for most infectious diseases is unusual. So Soren does a lot of work around CMV, and really covers a lot of aspects of CMV. So really he's done a lot of work looking at CMV transmission, understanding pathogenesis and management of infection, from acquisition of CMV, understanding the transmission dynamics using mathematical models based on clinical data, has worked on various CMV vaccines, and we're currently running a couple of phase 1 trials of different CMV vaccines, and has written some guidelines of better care of infants with congenital CMV, and ironically enough has been really instrumental in pushing the congenital CMV screening program in Ontario, which has rolled it out recently. And there's a couple of publications from the work that he has done, and I think we're all waiting to see what happens with that Ontario program in terms of how that plays out. And then in terms of understanding vaccine immunity, this is a study that I did with Toby Coleman that was here, that was a fantastic study to be part of. And as pediatricians, while we're focused on kids, this is a study we did in adults, and over the next minute while I describe it, it'll become apparent why we didn't do it in children. And so we asked these adults to come 12 times to the vaccine center here over a 6-month period, but there was this very intense period where they came on day of vaccination. This was a hepatitis B vaccine study, so day of the first dose, a day after, 3 days, 7 days, and 14 days after, and then a month after for the second dose, and then we gave them the third dose. We collected blood at all these time points. Over the course of the study, we took about 500 mils of blood from these people. We did 2 lymph node aspirates from the draining lymph node in the axilla from these individuals before and after vaccination. It was done by one of the interventional radiologists here at Children's, and we took microbiome samples. And what we found using some, real sort of all the tricks that we have in the immunology toolbox of the 21st century, that potentially two markers may be sufficient to predict response to 1 dose of hepatitis B vaccine. And here, these are some graphs which show the antibody titer after hepatitis B vaccination across the x-axis and the prediction across the y-axis, and there was about 20% error or 80% accuracy of the model that some people much smarter than me came up with. And the 2 markers were these 2 molecules which you've probably never heard of. I'd certainly never heard of them until we did this study, showing that if you measure just these 2 biomarkers in dendritic cells specifically, that it seems to separate out, on the day of vaccination, it seems to separate out the responders to the non-responders, which was amazing. And what was even more amazing is that when we went into the literature, we found that you could manipulate these molecules with a TLR3 agonist poly-IC, and so we're now doing some work to see if you can essentially prime people to have a better response to vaccination by giving them the agonist before you give them the vaccine, so before you give them the antigen, separating out the adjuvant from the antigen. So we'll see where that goes, but that's some really interesting work. So the clinical trials, I think, which probably over the 30 years has been what the VEC is most well known for, has been really the bread and butter. I started doing this when I had to give another presentation, and I pulled out from the Immunize BC website the BC immunization schedule, and then started highlighting all the trials that the VEC has been involved in and linked them to the schedule, and I ended up putting a box around everything except the MMR vaccine. So it's really shaped the way the immunization schedule is done in BC, and we're currently doing a couple of trials, one around the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, and we're actually comparing the current 2+1 schedule with a 1+1 schedule, so reducing it even further potentially, and also we're doing a direct head-to-head comparison of the 3 different men ACWI vaccines that are currently given in adolescents. So should have data from that in the next 12 to 18 months. So again, the HPV vaccine is sort of one of the real landmark trials that was done here, comparing the 2 versus 3 doses. And this work led by Simon Dobson and Gina Ogilvy, directly led, and Monica was involved in this study, directly led to the change in the World Health Organization recommendation internationally from 3-dose to a 2-dose schedule, which we now routinely use. And again, we are partly involved, but there's some very large 1-dose trials now going on with HPV vaccine. So in 5 years' time, we may be here talking about a 1-dose HPV program. And this is our current data from the follow-up from that original trial, which is the Quest study. And so we're doing 10-year follow-up of all of the girls and women who were in that original trial. And this is the initial 10-year data comparing the girls who had 2 doses, the girls who had 3 doses, and then the women who had 3 doses who are slightly older. And this shows the proportion of these different groups who still have have measurable levels of antibody, I should say, rather than protective. We don't know how much you need, but have measurable levels of antibody 10 years after their vaccination. And you can see that for each of the 4 vaccine types, the purple bars are the 10-year data, the green bars are the 2-year data. The 2-dose girls really win across the board. So, that initial better response in the 2-dose girls compared with the 3-dose girls or the 3-dose women is maintained all the way out at least to 10 years, as far as I can see, which I think is very reassuring for the program. I think BC was one of the first in Canada to implement the 2-dose regime. So Julie, I'm not going to talk too much about some of Julie's work, mainly because she's going to be here next week to talk about it herself. So she leads the Canadian National Vaccine Safety Network, or CANVAS, which does real-time safety analysis of influenza vaccine every single influenza season across the country. And every year they recruit about 40,000 adults and children into that study. She does a lot of work understanding and addressing vaccine hesitancy. And the clinic that has been mentioned a couple of times that we have here allows us to do direct knowledge translation from the research that Julie and others do around vaccine hesitancy directly into the clinic. And through the clinic, we also are part of this special immunization clinics network, where we recruit children who have had adverse events after immunization, review them, do a risk assessment, and then make decisions whether or not to re-immunize them. And this is just some of our more recent data showing the children that we've had in the study over the last few years. So most of them have had injection site reactions or allergic-like reactions. So 36 here had injection site reactions and 61 allergic-like reactions. And the green bars show the proportion of cases in which we recommend re-immunization, which is essentially almost everyone. There's few who've had neurological events, but again, around 2/3 of the time, we would recommend re-immunization for those as well. And there's a real mixture of other events. And again, most of the time, we recommend re-immunization. And these are the ones, so then some of them, I would say, some of them we offer re-immunization in the clinic. And even before we had the immunization clinic, we were doing this through the infectious disease clinic. Some of them claim they will go back and get it done through public health or their physician or their vaccine provider. And we know, because this is part of a research study, we don't follow them all up. And I would say if they leave the clinic without getting their vaccine, it's about 50-50 if they actually follow through on what they've said they're going to do, unfortunately. So there's 87 of this group that we have re-immunized with a similar antigen. So some of the times they've finished, if there's an adverse reaction to their 2nd dose of MMR, then they're not due any other MMR anyway, so it's hard to assess recurrence. But 87 of the times where they've been re-immunized with a similar vaccine, 1/4 of them have had any sort of adverse event. 8% have had the same adverse event, but all of them have been either similar severity or less severe, and none of them have been really truly severe. So it's very reassuring, I think, for us. We see, and Jane sees some of these kids as well, and there's a lot of time it's a very skewed population. We don't get the ones who've had relatively mild adverse events because their community vaccine providers, public health, just deal with them and re-immunize them anyway. So we are seeing the more severe end of the spectrum, but again, probably not the super severe end of the spectrum. But it's reassuring that we can safely re-immunize the majority of these children. So this was, Julie does some of this work, and this is one of her more recent publications led by Eve Dubé in Montreal, and really speaks to what Monica mentioned as well around your role as pediatricians in vaccine hesitancy. And this was a study where they interviewed parents of children and asked them around different sources of information they get for vaccination. So there was the pharmaceutical industry, the media, academic researchers, public health, the government, and doctors. And they've divided up in this graph. Each of these different sections have got those who had a strong intention to vaccinate their child and those who had no, low, or moderate intention to vaccinate their child. So this is just intention to vaccinate, it's what they actually did. And so what you can see here is that for doctors, those who were going to vaccinate their child, over 50% of people strongly agreed that doctors were a reliable source of information and do what's best. But even 20% of those who were sort of vaccine hesitant would still trust their doctor. Then in the middle somewhere, the academic researchers and public health, who is about 30% from the pro-vaccine people and about 10 to 15% from those who were vaccine hesitant. And then down at the bottom are the pharmaceutical industry and the media, which is sort of less than 10% either group. But what's fascinating to me is that even the vaccine hesitant people trust their doctors more than the most pro-vaccine people trust the pharmaceutical industry or the media. So I think that really highlights the role that physicians play in vaccination of their patients. So just a quick plug for our immunization clinic. So some of you will know about it, some of you will have referred your patients to it. So we opened in October 2017. Within the hospital, at least, it's highly visible. It's in the ambulatory care building, which most people seem to call the Starbucks building, because it's down the hallway from Starbucks. It's very accessible. We didn't realize at the time, but it actually happens to be right next to the gateway from Starbucks to the new hospital. So, pretty much everyone walks through and walks past it at some point or another, which is fantastic. We have nurses and physicians providing expert immunization care. So Jane does the majority of the physician clinics. We have one physician clinic a week on a Thursday morning, and the rest of the time it's a nurse run service. And this is really, really excellent nurses providing immunizations. And when Jane's not there on a Thursday morning, if there's any issues, then I'm there for any advice or the pediatric ID team in the hospital. So there's always physician backup for the clinic, but I get called less frequently than I thought I would, so that's good. And we really focus on the whole family. So we don't just immunize the Children's Hospital patients. We offer to immunize their siblings, their parents, their grandparents, people who are visiting them, and also the same for BC Women's Hospital as well. I think just from the anecdotal feedback we've got, there's sort of reassurance that the Children's Hospital is promoting immunization. It seems to be a credible organization within the community. And I think I really value the link that we have between acute healthcare and public health. And I think that comes from both sides, and really great that the hospital, I think, have acknowledged their responsibility in terms of preventive healthcare and not just about acute healthcare. And we do have access to Paris and Panorama. Thank you, Monica. And I've been told we'll have access to the Fraser Health Paris as well when it comes. So we'll see. We'll see. So what do we do? So we do routine vaccines, catch-up vaccines. We do immunization counseling, either for the children after previous adverse events, as I've mentioned, but also for vaccine hesitancy, complex medical conditions where some of the vaccine needs are very complicated. And we do personalized schedules for the complex cases of children with cancer and other immune suppressive medications. And we have nurse and physician consultations, and the education, advocacy, and outreach, I think, is really important. And we're sort of starting within the hospital, and I think it's, that's been really to raise the profile of immunization amongst the other specialists. Monica already alluded to the fact that some of these children do fall through the cracks, especially those with chronic medical conditions. They spend so much time coming to see specialists here, they never get back to their pediatrician or to their family physician, and their specialist here hasn't traditionally thought of immunization as being in their scope of work. And so I think we're trying to raise that and trying to make it really everyone's problem. We had a fantastic case of a child probably a year or two ago now where the child was unimmunized, and it transpired that the older child had to stop or was told to stop their immunizations because they're being worked up for a possible rheumatologic condition. So at the time, or a possible immunologic condition, at the time they were told, don't have any more immunizations until we finish this workup. Child finished their workup. They did not have an immunodeficiency, but no one actually explicitly said to the parents, you can now immunize your child, those vaccines that you missed. And because of the concern, the sibling, who at that point I think was 5 or 6, had never had any vaccines because they'd also been told don't vaccinate the other kids until we figure out what's wrong with your child. And you can see how these things kind of get through in families because no one's ever addressed the problem. So that just sort of going back, all the different things that we do and the fact that we're able to translate a lot of the work into the clinic and backwards and forwards. And then finally, a plug for a conference that I'm co-organizing, which is here, which is an International Neonatal Maternal Immunization Symposium in September, which will be downtown at the Sheraton, and some really world experts to talk about neonatal and maternal immunization for people who are interested. And that's the website. So thank you very much. And I think this website is really good for if you're looking to direct your patients towards reliable vaccine safety information. This is a WHO website, and then it links out to other, I think they've currently got about 20 different websites that they have essentially been rubber stamped by the WHO as reliable sources. And I think Immunize BC is one of those, Immunize Canada is on there, iBoost Immunity is on there. So there's a lot of, there's a few BC websites on there that have been given the official rubber stamp, but there's also sites from the US and from Europe and different sources. So it's a fantastic kind of one-stop shop for directing patients to, because as we all know, they're going to go online. So you might as well try and push them online to where you want them to go rather than what they're going to find through Dr. Google. So thanks. Happy to have any questions if there's time.
Any questions?
Do I have to press a button? Oh, I did anyway.
Okay. Yeah, so they can.
For the influenza vaccine and children with egg allergy, do we have to monitor them afterwards? Sit them in the waiting room for a certain period of time?
Yeah, I mean, so we routinely, for the ones that we're doing in the hospital, we routinely sort of monitor, if you like, them for 15 minutes. What we decided very early on, though, is that our waiting room is not going to be big enough, especially in flu season, for lots of children to hang out 15 minutes. So what we do is we have this, and we stole the idea from a clinic in Australia, we have this bright orange sticker where we write the sort of time and we stick it on them and then say, as long as you stay within the hospital for 15 minutes, you can do what you like. And then once your time is up, look on the sticker, you can go. You don't need to sort of check in or come back. And it means if they have suddenly sort of anaphylaxis collapse in the Starbucks lineup, which is usually where they go, someone can see the orange sticker and see, oh, they just had a vaccine. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. And public health, maybe Jessica can speak to that more, that whether you would routinely observe children or insist that they stay there for a period of time in your clinics.
I think that's the standard
Yeah.
practice.
15, yeah.
Yeah.
Good, thank you very much.
Yep.
Oh, one more question.
Have you looked at the impact on the microbiome in these kids who've been vaccinated, the newer vaccines?
Yeah, so do you mean the impact of the vaccine on the microbiome or the impact of the
Right,
microbiome
right.
on vaccine
No,
response?
Both ways, both directions.
So yes, so we've looked at that in a couple of different studies. We haven't found massive amount of sort of positive correlation yet, but I think partly that's because the numbers are quite small. But we're still, we started almost routinely collecting microbiome samples in a lot of our studies. So that's interesting.
Avon, there's 2 questions
Oh,
from
two.
the WebEx. So I'll just read them out.
Okay.
Okay, if thimerosal is only in multi-dose vaccines, why do 2, 4, 6-month-olds have a spike in the mercury level in their blood as demonstrated by the chart shown after vaccination?
So I think if you go back historically, it's been in many more vaccines. And so that was done in the context of a study where infant vaccines containing thimerosal were given to the children of those ages. But I think currently it's not found in as many vaccines as it was 15 or 20 years ago.
Thimerosal?
But yeah,
It's only in multi-dose flu.
Yeah.
None of the childhood vaccines.
currently. But it used to be in more.
Multi-dose. But now we have Influenza Hexa therapy. But the only childhood vaccine that if they're getting the multi-dose, but the number of single dose.
Yeah. And
it's not in the LA lab.
No.
So just for those that are on WebEx or at home, the comment was that now the only vaccine where there may be thimerosal is in the multi-dose Hep B, multi-dose influenza.
Yeah, I mean, children get their hepatitis B as an Influenza Hexa product for the most part, and that doesn't contain thimerosal.
Okay, so Infinrix Hexa does.
Influenza vaccinated most of the time. So if it's a multi-dose QIV, because children we recommend quality number influenza vaccine, that would contain that.
Okay. And there's one more question. Can Manish give an example of a neurological adverse event where they would recommend reimmunization versus a neurological event where they would not recommend reimmunization?
Yeah, so that's, sorry?
Guillain-Barré, maybe?
Yeah, so I mean, the Guillain-Barré is commonly comes up, and so, if it's within 6 weeks of a previous flu-containing or Tdap vaccine, then you would avoid those vaccines. And actually, we had one case, though, here, I think a couple of years ago now, where a child developed Guillain-Barré the day after flu vaccination, and we actually decided that that was too soon for an immune-mediated reaction and did recommend re-vaccinating that particular child in that case. So I think it's very case-specific. So a lot of it is seizures. I think you had one this morning of this child with an unusual encephalopathic type episode after vaccination that didn't sound like it was actually related to the vaccines that were given. So I think it's really, I mean, there's small numbers in the series we have, so that's really individualized.
Paul?
This, I guess, isn't necessarily for you, and Monica. How is one health authority like BCH allowed to go rogue and just not share it? I just don't get that.
In terms of not using Panorama, or
they're not sharing all of their data, right? Is that correct?
Participate in the provincial registry. So, well, I think they're no longer going to be allowed to do that, I guess. So the plan is that probably sometime this year, they are supposed to be bringing their data over into the
How does that
provincial
arise in the
registry.
first place? It's just a little island
I
that
think-
says.
how many hours do you have to?
I think regions have a lot of autonomy and, different provinces have taken different approaches.
Mhm.
But here, Vancouver Coastal historically, I think, have a lot of autonomy. And
Yes.
so,
But I think actually, ironically enough, since you asked the question, for us in the hospital, it's been easier for us to access the immunization data from VCH because Paris has been linked to Care Connect, which we can access through Cerner, whereas we can't as of yet, but hopefully soon we'll be able to access Panorama. So I think it's not that, it is what it is. I think it's.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
We started a bit late, so we're a bit behind. So we'll have a 5-minute break just so everybody can stand up and stretch, and then we'll resume, or maybe a 4-minute break.
just pass it to him. Yeah, I'll leave it on right now, but I can mute it. So when
So after the break, we have Avon again, and Parm, Dr. Bougie. Bowie, oh, I'm sorry. I already have it. And I know you as an allergist. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about your background. It's quite interesting. Come on up.
I did my pediatrics training in Bombay, 1977, where we had to do everything, right from collecting urine LPs, and ran the allergy asthma clinic in 1977. Did my MD in pediatrics with my thesis in neonatology, neonatal infections. Came to Canada, had to do my training all over again. So did my fellowship in NICU, PICU, the residency in Saskatoon again, and then was faculty at CHIO in Ottawa, where all my interns moved over, and then we came here. So
And now you're a community pediatrician
for the last 30 years.
In Surrey, and guys are going to talk about what does immunization up to date really mean. That's always a thing I have with medical students and residents, like what the heck is up to date, right? And how to ask the right questions. So.
Thanks, Jane. So this was a topic that we were given, how to briefly screen and discuss with parents in the hospital setting and in the office setting. So I'm going to try to very quickly go through a few techniques that I use in the hospital. This is just based on experience, and Paramjeet will talk about in the office. Disclosure, this session is sponsored by an unrestricted grant from GSK. I don't have any other financial disclosures. Both of us have quite a strong personal interest in immunizations. And objectives are as in your handout. So briefly and effectively screen and provide intervention and education within the context of any patient encounter, and be able to advise parents and patients about local immunization providers. So I put the history of immunizations all on one slide. I wanted to make it really brief. When I was 8 years old, I received a book. It was a book about physicians through history, starting with Hippocrates, and it fascinated me. The story that fascinated me the most was the one about smallpox vaccination and Edward Jenner. The Middle East was way ahead of Europe. In 1716, Lady Mary Montagu and her husband went to Turkey. Whatever diplomats did then, I don't know. But they used to have smallpox variolation parties in Turkey, where they would take a little old woman would come with a needle under her cloak that had been coated with smallpox pus. She kept it in a nutshell or whatever, and she would inject it in people so that they would become immune. So Lady Mary Montagu thought this was quite fascinating. She took this back to England. It wasn't met with overwhelming excitement, but it was done a little bit. And sometimes it worked beautifully, and sometimes the victims, the patients, those who were immunized, variolated, died. Edward Jenner, who we sort of consider the father of immunization, in 1796, he had been researching this for quite a few years. In 1796, he reported immunizing people, vaccinating people for smallpox with cowpox, because it had been noted by milkmaids who got cowpox that they didn't get smallpox. And he wrote a treatise, and I can't remember the whole name, but it was about variolae vaccinii. Vaccinii is from the Latin vacca, which is cows. So that's where vaccination comes from. I'm old enough that I was born during the tail end of the polio epidemic, and I'm totally healthy. My grade 1 teacher had polio. I know quite a few people, or did as I was growing up, who had polio. When I started school, I started in grade 1 because there was no kindergarten in BC then. And I got measles, mumps, and chickenpox. And I brought them home to my little sister, and we both had measles, mumps, and chickenpox, and it wasn't fun. My cousin went deaf from measles. So yeah, it does have some side effects. And then later on, I caught German measles. So I have good immunity. I remember when the oral polio vaccine came out. I lived in a small town in interior BC, and sometimes the public health nurse came to our town, and that's how we got our immunizations if we didn't have them from the family doctor. We were all lined up down the hallway in the school to get our sugar cube with the oral polio vaccine on it. It was a pretty big deal in town. I started my peds residency in 1981, so there was lots of Hib, lots and lots and lots of Hib. Everybody had Hib. Meningitis or bacteremia or pneumococcus or whatever. So we did lots of LPs. And then Hib vaccine came out, and by the 1990s, most people were immunized, most kids. And then meningococcal C vaccine came out, and we did fewer LPs, and then Pneumovax came out, we did even fewer LPs, and the face of pediatrics has changed because of immunizations. So, in the hospital and in my office, I'm a bit of an immunization evangelist. So I almost always, every once in a while I forget and I feel really badly, but I ask everybody if their immunizations are up to date. I don't say, are your kids' shots up to date? Are your child's immunizations up to date? Because people will say yes. And so I say, if they're 2 years old, has your child had his or her shots up to age 18 months yet? Or if they're 8 years old, have you had your kindergarten booster yet? So I take the age and phrase it that way. Or I ask the parents what immunizations or what age immunizations. Nobody can remember all of them. I can't remember all of them. Has your child had? To find out, because it's so often, if you ask, are your child's shots up to date? They say yes, because they intend to go get that 18-month shot done. Or they think maybe it's done, but they're not really sure. Or they don't actually know when the next one's supposed to be or when the last one was supposed to be. So I think if you ask the question in a more open-ended way, then you can get more information. So pediatric inpatients, when we do the consult, if we find out that the immunizations are not up to date, then it's parents and patients are tired, they're stressed, they're sick, they haven't slept all night because of whatever illness brought the child in. So I just mention that, oh, before you go home, I want to talk to you a little bit about immunizations. Is that okay? And if possible, I like to make it relevant to that particular child, their age, perhaps their illness, but being totally careful to avoid any blame. So it's not, oh yeah, well, here's your kid, he's got influenza, let's talk about getting flu shot next year. It's what's, what might be out in the community right now. Oh, there's a lot of pertussis out there right now, or, we've got pertussis in the neighboring community, let's talk about that. Or what particular immunizations are you concerned about that you haven't had done, or whatever. So try and make it relevant to that particular child, not just an overarching, oh, you need to get your shots up to date. And after I've said I want to set aside time, I ensure that I do discuss that prior to discharge, and it doesn't have to be an hour-long consultation. It's brief, it's to the point, it's what's missing and what can we do to reassure you about this or to encourage you to go ahead and get it done. And sometimes people have a lot of vaccine hesitancy, want a lot more education, are not outright refusers, but we can make follow-up appointments in our offices to further educate and discuss if we need more time. Starting in August, I remind everybody that their child should get the flu shot this year, and so should the baby sister and brother and mom and dad and whoever else is eligible for influenza immunization. And I do that basically with everybody. In the discharge summary that I dictate, or if I get the students to do it and the child's immunizations are not up to date, I put one of the discharge recommendations to update the immunizations. And so therefore, the family doctor hopefully will see that as well, and they can also remind the family. And going way back to Reye's syndrome, if I'm starting a child on ASA for Kawasaki disease, which is something that we do in the community, we want to make sure the varicella and influenza, if it's influenza season, immunizations are up to date, so they don't get Reye's syndrome. In the emergency department, we're back to stressed and tired parents, so they don't really probably want to hear anything about immunizations. They just want their child to feel better, and they want to go home. So again, if the immunizations are not up to date, because we still need to know if they actually have had their immunizations, we might want to mention, oh, let's talk about something that's relevant to that child, and that I would like to discuss in the future. If they are going home and not being admitted, then it's worthwhile, if they are not up to date and they're hesitant, to offer an office follow-up appointment. Sometimes people just need their memory jogged and reminded. In the nursery, most people are really happy to have their, in the special care nursery, they're happy to follow all recommendations for immunizations because their baby has been through a lot, they're fragile, they want to ensure that they do everything that they can to maintain their child's health. But we have to remind people, we have to remember to remind parents that the shots are to be given at the chronological age of 2 months. Of course, they should be given in the nursery if the baby's still an inpatient, which they're done at Surrey and other tertiary level hospitals and here, but not necessarily in the smaller community hospitals. And reassure the parents that there is a good immune response and the baby is being protected against diseases that would be very serious for them when we do start the immunizations on time. And again, remind them that the family member should have influenza immunization. When I'm orienting the medical students and I'm going through with them how to do a pediatric history consult, I tell them if they are giving me the history and they say immunization's up to date, I'm going to have a temper tantrum because I want them to ensure what ages the immunizations have been given. So are they actually up to date? I did have a med student once, and we went into the room and we saw a child who'd been admitted with asthma, vaccine hesitant parents, child had no immunizations, siblings had no immunizations. And so this was the second day, the child was getting better. And so I talked to the parent about it, and she said, yeah, I think we should go ahead and do it after our discussion. I see that, you know, my worries were not really well founded. And then later in the day, the student went to see an outpatient in the clinic and came back to me so excited. He said, I've just convinced them to start having their child immunized. This is the best thing I've ever done since I started medical school. He was so excited because he'd seen that in the morning and he'd done the same thing in the afternoon. So it works. You just have to teach and talk. And providers out in the community, we have public health nurses, family doctors, if kids are aged over 5 years. Pharmacists are, may do it. There's a pharmacy certification course. If there's very complications, medically complex kids, or if they come into children's a lot because of complex problems, or of course, as has been reviewed, if there's been adverse events, there's the BCCH Family Immunization Clinic. Some of these kids in grade 6 that haven't had their second HPV is probably because they fainted and cried and had tummy aches at school after the first one. And so we can encourage them to go to the health unit for the second one. And there's lots of other things that we can do as community pediatricians, such as if they have a severe needle phobia, they can have some sedation such as Ativan to help with needle phobia and getting their immunizations done at the health unit. So I give one example of a family, or a couple of examples. Often people are partially immunized, so you just have to talk about the ones, MMR, autism, still, you know, every week, right? And review the specific concerns and educate them. And hopefully they will agree that, yeah, we should get caught up in the immunizations. And sometimes it's just, they haven't been done, we haven't got around to it, we're okay, we're part, you know, we've had the one shot. So we just want to ensure that they understand the reasons for a booster. One thing that we often see, especially because I'm out in the Fraser Valley, not quite in the East Fraser, but see people from there, is girls who don't receive the HPV vaccine because of religious concerns about sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy and starting sex because they've had the HPV vaccine. And we still get that a lot. So that was the question I put. I submitted, and I'm glad everybody got 100%. So that means you can all advise parents that it has been demonstrated in BC, published in the CMAJ in October, that we can't say it's a cause and effect, but as we have had HPV vaccine in BC, teenage girls have had safer sexual practices statistically. So that counteracts the argument that if you give that shot to my daughter, she's going to go out and have sex. And now I am going to turn it over to Paramjeet. I do have a couple of questions. If anybody can answer these later. It's not possible in my community hospital, or I have, maybe it is, Catherine, maybe it's happened, but I can't get it done, to have preemies who have been transferred back and turned 2 months old to be immunized in our nursery, because public health doesn't come in to the hospital, and the hospital nurses aren't licensed to give immunizations. How do we do this? I imagine it happens in other places. Another dilemma I've had many times over the years, if we've had a child who's been critically ill with a vaccine preventable disease and the parents still refuse immunizations. And that might be for the CDC people. Paramjeet, over to you. And this is your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for covering most of the stuff that I need to talk about. And I can just add to that because we are looking at a different perspective. I have a conflict of interest to declare. I have suffered this discomfort of some of the infectious diseases that are preventable now. And that has been my first-hand experience that I shared with my patients. Now, looking at the question, what do you mean by up to date? Sometimes I wonder, why do we have to ask this question? Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. A case early in my career shaped my attitude to vaccinations. Looking back, 40 years, the question was, are you vaccinated or have you had the disease? Because the list of diseases that kids had were much more than the vaccinations available. And now, looking back in those days and the agony and the pain that the patient had to go through, we look back and see where we have come from. Looking at the case report 40 years ago, there was this 1-year-old girl who was brought to the emergency by her mother. She just brought a bag, of clothes in which we looked in and saw there was a little baby, which was a bag of bones and skin with just eyes which are sunken and hardly breathing. She was limp, dehydrated, and full of rash. So we asked the mother what happened. She said baby has had Mata. In Indian language, Mata means goddess or Devi. So cultural beliefs there shaped how the disease was addressed and treated. One of the legends or one of the theories they had was that since moms are pregnant for 9 months and there's amenorrhea, that the rash that comes out is a bad blood coming out. So it's considered as normal. And therefore, they did not need to treat it. So many patients who had measles would not come to your attention until they had complications which are almost life-threatening. And looking back at other theories and other things, some people said it's a visitation by the goddess. So why should we treat? So coming back to this child again. So we had to resuscitate the child because she was limp, dehydrated, dark skin, collapsed veins. So we had to find an intraosseous access to provide the intravenous therapy. So we did that. A couple of hours later, the child collapsed. We could see the terror and agony in the mom's eyes. She was in shock. She collapsed. The child's siblings started crying. So when you see this image, and when you come now and see where we are, we still fail to comprehend the benefits of vaccines. We need to remember that vaccines are not as dangerous or as problematic as the disease themselves. So going back to the child again, so the next day we could, see few veins. I had to use the transillumination, taking a flashlight. We didn't have the high-tech spectroscope, lights. So a flashlight against the skin to see the black lines of the veins, and it put a line in and started dehydrating the child. So that was the beginning of this child's journey. After the child had improved, we asked mom what had transpired. The first day or two, she was reluctant because the mother-in-law was with her, so she refused to talk. Then a couple of days later, when the child was better, opening her eyes, and the mother used to sleep with the child, we noticed that mother would not eat any food. We wondered why. So we asked her what has happened. She said, I can't afford it. So we got on a resident salary of about $1 a day. We tried to get some food from mom and provide her with dinner so she could breastfeed the child and get some nutrition from herself as well as the child. So over the next few days, we established a rapport and talked to her about other children. How are they doing? Engaged in a dialogue. Talked to her mother-in-law. So engaging the primary caregiver in the family. Later on, we were able to get access to the community as a whole. So looking at the primary case, we're able to reach out to her family and to the community by engaging in dialogue. We did not have to ridicule her or mock her or in any way provide any information that was against her beliefs. So gradually we had to engage her and then carry on. So what we need to do again in this current environment of up to date is, as Evan said, train the trainees as what it means to be up to date. Just asking about have you had all your shots? That doesn't cut the cake. So you have to ask them specifically. So I have usually a sheet of paper, ask them to take off when they come to the office, and that has gone a long ways towards initiating a conversation. And I reserve these dialogues for the end of the day because they are open to spending as much time as they want, and they have no hesitation asking any questions that they are hesitant about. For brevity of time, I have the sign saying 1 minute. I have a wish that we come up with an anti-screen vaccine as soon as possible. Thank you.
All right, so Jessica.
I just want to, well, we can, yeah. The recording stops at 9:30, but that doesn't mean that we'll have to actually stop. I just wanted to say that, okay? So I won't be.
I want to respect everyone's time.
Yeah, yeah, okay, great. Now, this is, okay.
I know
Okay,
who Jessica
okay.
is.
All right.
I didn't know what Jessica did, but I know who Jessica is because Jessica has been on the BC Immunization Committee with me. I knew her in her role with Northern Health, First Nations Health, Jessica. But now you said you've changed roles and you're now the immunization promotion nurse with Immunization BC.
Do I need to talk in that or this?
You don't have to.
So Monica and I shared a USB, so I'm just going to take a second to get that loaded. So my name is Jessica Harper. I'm a registered nurse. My background is as a public health nurse in Fraser Health, and then I worked as the vaccine educator at the BC Centre for Disease Control with Monica's immunization team, and then I've been working with communicable disease management, immunization, and also tuberculosis with the First Nations Health Authority for the past 5 years. And for the past year, I have been the immunization promotions nurse for Immunize BC. Immunize BC provides evidence-based immunization information for BC residents. And thank you so much to both of you just for setting that up for me. For those of you that are joining over the webcast, I gave out several resources to the participants, and I just want to highlight to you that these are all available to you electronically online. So I'm actually going to step over and steal from one of my colleagues here. Nice to be yours. So on the BC Centre for Disease Control website, if you put in immunization communication tool, you will actually find a digital downloadable copy. This is something that you can have if you have a computer or iPad in your clinic setting that you can have available electronically. Also the Ask tool as well. If you go onto the BC CDC website and you just search ASK or the Ask approach, both of these now our BC CDC website does allow you to search it in a much more functional way, which is great. And so you can download and have both of these electronically. I did give out paper copies here. I also gave out a copy of the PowerPoint, which will be available in a PDF format for you to download after. And just the respect of the time that we have, I believe that we're scheduled to stop around 9:20 or 9:30 this evening, and I know that there's a post-test and another speaker after me. I do just want to disclose that I don't have any affiliations with a pharmaceutical, medical, or communications organization, although I did have both wine and dinner sponsored by JSK this evening. And so I am just going to briefly touch on vaccine hesitancy, and then I'm actually going to spend time around the tools that I've given out and how I can actually see you utilizing those in your practice. Also for medical students, residents, new staff that you have coming on, and how these are really useful tools. So when we look at healthcare professional curriculums across Canada and the world, the amount of time and education that you get on immunization is so small and such a small amount. It's often an area that we as healthcare professionals may not feel confident talking about. And so I just want to highlight some of the resources and tools that are available to you for finding answers to those common questions and approaches that you can take in practice. So has anyone ever seen this cartoon before? I just envisioned the meningococcus on the bottom being like, hey kid, want to play? And while we're sometimes, it can be a very, vaccines and immunizations can be a very polarizing issue. And it's actually interesting when I was thinking of what Manesh presented, and he said that parents don't trust the media. But in my lived experience as like an immunization promotions nurse, so much of the misinformation and sources of vaccine hesitant beliefs are actually coming from the online environment, social media, and friends, like at a mom and baby play group, that sort of thing. So it's like when people are asked, they're like, oh no, I know I shouldn't trust the media, but yet then when they choose not to have certain vaccines or not having vaccines at all, or I'll wait till they're older, often that was introduced through social media or an online environment. And so vaccine hesitancy, just as an overall umbrella, basically is a refusal of a vaccine or delay in immunization or the schedule due to concerns about immunization. And I always love that in like pictures and cartoons, the needles are always so huge. It's like, I think that's part of it. I was like, we gotta like use small needles, or sometimes they have like an immunoglobulin, like 5cc syringe and just like a huge needle on there. And I was like, oh, use a different picture, please. If we think about that, 25% have some needle fears and 10% are needle phobic in our like adult population, let's be advertising with some smaller needles. So when you think of immunization and vaccine hesitancy, you may not be aware that the WHO designated this as one of the top 10 threats to global health in 2019. So for us as healthcare professionals, this is where we are literally can be saving lives. And I think as we move towards elimination of polio, for instance, and one of the things they use in that approach is to eliminate it anywhere, we have to eliminate it everywhere. And the complexities that we have around that as we're trying to move towards elimination, and just the fact that measles, which we're seeing just these horrific outbreaks, if we look at the Philippines in 2019, and over 11,000 cases and over 200 deaths, most of those in children. It is just, it's tragic, especially that it's preventable, and it's something that we could eliminate. It could be our target for elimination after polio. So the World Health Organization, they talk about the complexities of vaccine hesitancy, and that we have complacency, like I just forgot, I didn't get to it, inconvenience. You only offer clinics during the day when I'm working, so am I supposed to take time off work to get immunized? And then just lack of confidence, and I think a lot of that comes from social media, the online environments, and also healthcare workers not making a strong recommendation and spending time and emphasis on vaccines in our practice. So you have lots of physicians and nurses, for instance, who are anti-vaccine. So if that doesn't lead to confusion for the public, and confusion around who you should trust and what you should believe. So influences around vaccine hesitancy, I think you're getting conflicting information from a variety of sources. There's really a lack of understanding about the vaccine, and I like the stories that were shared about when you actually experience and see vaccine preventable diseases. So I've done a lot of international development work in public health. So I've worked in communities where entire families lost all of their children to measles in the Philippines, for example. And for me, that connection and my passion for vaccine, part of it comes from that I've seen it. But for most of our parents and for most of our healthcare professionals, they may have never seen a vaccine preventable disease in their life or understand how serious they are. And again, mistrust of the source of information around, especially pharmaceutical companies, and the profit around it, and why should I trust or believe what's being recommended to me. I really think like chickenpox, for example. So when we look at research that comes from Ben Tan and what he's done around varicella and across Canada, and people just think chickenpox is normal. And what complications could there be? And I had it, why shouldn't my child have it? I think someone's mentioned, like, for instance, measles around social cultural beliefs. So measles that we had out in Fraser East, whether it's from your faith group or different groups that you're involved in around vaccine preventable diseases and the vaccine themselves, and then perceived risk. Often parents think if I just don't do anything, then it's safer and it's less risky, but they're not actually realizing that they're leaving their child at risk for vaccine preventable diseases. So I'm actually going to skip a whole bunch of slides here, just in the time period that we have. I do just want to highlight, though, that vaccine beliefs are on a continuum. The majority of the clients we're working with are relaxed or believers. They're like, you tell me to get them, I'm going to get them. I'm relaxed about it. Okay, yes, let's do the shots today. Where we should be focusing a lot of our time is the cautious parent. So I think I should get some vaccines, but I don't know if I should get all of them. I'm going to get the MMR vaccine, but I'm going to wait till they're older. They may have a lot of questions. They're kind of on the fence. But this is actually where we can make a difference. We can make an impact. So it's not the client that says, no, I don't want any vaccines. There's nano tracking chips from the government in them. They're monitoring the population. This is not where you should be spending your time. You need to bring that conversation to a close, still maintaining that relationship and trust, keeping the door open, providing information if they want it, but you're going to be stuck in a never-ending loop of fact tennis, and you're never going to win in that situation. Where we need to be spending our time is with our cautious parents. But what's hard about that is time. How much time do you have in your clinics and in your day-to-day practice to be spending the amount of time that they need? At the Western Canadian Immunization Forum, Annie was presenting, who's one of the nurses at the Vaccine Evaluation Center at BC Children's, and she shared about a young girl who wanted to get her vaccines, but she was totally needle phobic, and the first set of vaccines took 3 hours. And that's where it's actually, we're so fortunate to have that special immunization clinic, and they also offer telehealth services as well. I don't know if you said that, but I thought I'd plug that, because as a nurse that supports, as a nurse that supports First Nations communities, telehealth is often how they're going to access services and resources in community. And the Ask approach, so that is the ASK little folded handout that I gave you guys. Basically what it is, it's just providing you a structure or an approach to have immunization communication conversations. All of us have our own rhythms and practice and how we have those dialogues with clients, but it's just providing a method that you can use, and also that you can always be wrapping up those conversations with giving your patient your recommendation each time. So ASK stands for acknowledging your client's concerns, steering the conversation, so giving the facts, refuting the myths, and knowledge, knowing the facts well. Can we possibly know the answer to every banana pants conversation or question that you may get asked? It's like, what did you just ask me? What are you worried about? What do you think is in the vaccine? That's why we created the immunization communication tool, because healthcare professionals, the original was in 2008, the version that you got is from 2014, healthcare professionals said, we want to have at our fingertips evidence-based information for ourselves as the healthcare professionals, and then language for communicating with our clients at, like if we think about average health literacy, science literacy, maybe we're at like a grade 6 level with a lot of our parents. So wording and analogies and diagrams and graphs that you can use to communicate that information in a way that makes sense for your clients. And so I'm just gonna skip over that. So I always highlight, it's not about knowing all the answers to all the possible questions out there, but knowing the resources that are available to you and are already developed and have already created wording, you don't have to do that work. You have busy lives, busy practices. What tools are already available to you in print and online that you can use day to day? So I would encourage you to use the immunization communication tool. It's separated into common groupings of questions. So around safety, multiple injections, our favorite, vaccines cause autism, chronic diseases, what are the ingredients? My children are eating an organic diet and I'm breastfeeding, I don't need to vaccinate. Vaccines are gone, we don't need to vaccinate anymore. For the public, I would really encourage you to refer your clients to Immunize BC. That's not because this is also my day-to-day job, but maybe it kind of is. So really, it's just designed, it's a place where you can find the vaccine schedules for all the different ages, including adults, content on vaccine safety, all the different vaccine preventable diseases, tells them about the disease, the vaccines that we offer, why it's recommended, helps them find a flu clinic during flu season or a public health unit to get vaccines, and a whole section around tools and resources. So that's things like an immunization appointment reminder, an immunization schedule generator for kids under 6 for what vaccine should you be having when. This is also great if you are if you have medical students or others that are working with you. This is even, obviously the BC Centre for Disease Control is where we want healthcare professionals to go, but this is something that even becoming familiar with this, where you can direct your clients to the answers, especially if you don't have all the time to go over it with them. So has anyone ever had this situation? The baby's premature, they're so little. Why are there so many shots? It's going to overwhelm their immune system. I think the premature one, especially the fact that for you guys as pediatricians, you've got babies that were born so premature and they think, well, let's wait. They're born 2 months premature. Well, let's wait till they're actually 4 months to give the vaccines. So using the ask approach, it's really acknowledging their concerns and clarifying that you actually understand what they're asking, refuting the myth, but even it's just more like stating the facts. Sometimes when we restate the myth, that's what they remember 2 or 3 months down the road. So if we can frame our language around like vaccines are safe, vaccines, that like there's no relationship between autism and vaccines. Sometimes when we restate, it's interesting, it's new research that's coming out around a lot of our stuff. We've framed our communication around myths and we state the myth first and then we give the facts, and how we actually need to flip that in our communication. We need to state the fact and give the evidence around it. So it's something that I'm thinking about for Immunize BC that I need to actually reframe, because what will stick out in the parent's head? Well, you might have heard the myth that vaccines cause autism, but you give all the stats. But what they remember a couple months down the road is just something about vaccines and autism. So it makes sense to me, and I'm like, why have we not thought of that before? And then again, knowing the facts well, but part of that is using the tools that you have. So if a parent's like, well, I want to know all the components in this vaccine, you're like, no problem. Let's go to the BC CDC immunization website, Part 4, biological products. You can look at all of the contraindications, special considerations, potential allergens, rates of adverse events. We are so lucky in BC to have such a great tool available to us right at our fingertips. Also, some of you may look at the Canadian immunization guide, but really the BC CDC IMS manual should be our go-to, because it also gives us our specifics around what's publicly funded for us in our program and what the schedule is for that age group. So one of the examples of the graphics for the public that's in the ICT would be this. If someone says, I'm totally overwhelmed, there's way too many antigens, it's so many shots, actually improvements around vaccine science. So this really relates to the whole cell pertussis, right? So we stopped giving the whole cell pertussis where we had those large amount of antigens, and now we have those 3 or 5 part pertussis vaccines. So we have a lower amount. So people think, oh, there's more vaccines, you're giving more antigens to my baby, whereas we're actually giving them less. When you look inside the ICT, you're going to see one side is around clinical evidence, one side is around client knowledge, and then there are references throughout the document, which then you can refer to the research at the very back. So I loved Manesh, when you went into aluminum and all the vaccines that have aluminum in them, aluminum, so I feel like thimerosal is like somewhat trending out, and what has replaced it is aluminum. And I'm like, I love aluminum foil. It's great for hot dishes and casseroles. No, I don't say that to them. So, again, around the ingredients and why are they in there, and why would I ever want to inject these chemicals into my baby? Really the framing around, one of the things I wanted to highlight is we've tried to create more and more online resources because so many people in their day-to-day clinical practice may have an iPad or a computer or a mobile device. And so this is an example, for instance, that's available online, and it's all around vaccine ingredients, and it talks about aluminum, formaldehyde, and thimerosal, and you can click into the different sections and it expands, and this is available on the Immunize BC website. So that's also one of the ones that I wanted to highlight because it's right there, it's already online, it has the answers there on your fingertips. Oh, and so I'm hooked up to the internet, so this actually just brought me to the tool, and I can go into it and look at, well, why is there aluminum in vaccines? And again, it's plain language, and it's designed for you to use for, it's for the public. And let me go back to this. And I keep clicking back into the internet, which is hilarious. Okay, so so basically around the aluminum conversation, I've just included an example in here. Again, we want to listen to them and actually clarify, do we know what their concern is? Acknowledge that they want to do the best thing for their child, that they've been doing research, that they care about their child's health. Talk about misinformation that often you find online. Talk about aluminum, its safety, use the tools like the online infographic that's there. And again, always close the conversation with your recommendation, your support. You recommend them getting all vaccines on time, that you believe vaccines are safe, that you recommend that for them and their family. Because it's your recommendation as a healthcare professional that we see again and again in research, that it's your recommendation that really often influences a parent's decision. So for you that are on the webcast, the links to where the resources are from, and also the clinical resource section. If you would like to do some online communication courses, Pearls for Immunization Practice, those are all available for free on the BC Centre for Disease Control website to go through immunization topics. Again, if you have students that you're working with, people that are new into practice, those are also great free available immunization resources. Immunize BC also, I don't know, am I trying to drum up business for myself? But we do have an Ask Us feature. So that means that the public can go onto the website and say, hey, this is what my immunization record says. Is my measles vaccine up to date? And then I answer their question. So that is an online resource because we know parents and the public are going online to find their answers. So let's give them opportunities online to have evidence-based answers from a healthcare professional as opposed to Dr. Google. And again, this just came out of a vaccine safety survey in 2011, right at the top. I usually follow the advice of a child's doctor or nurse. And the power of your recommendation, this came out from Ev Dubé, but in a lot of other researches as well. You are a predictor of vaccine acceptance as a healthcare professional. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope you find these resources useful. Also, I just wanted to highlight, if you do not have vaccine preventable disease stories personally in your practice, there's quite a few online resources that you or your locums, et cetera, can use. So Voices for Vaccines is a parent-based organization out of the United States that has vaccine preventable disease stories. iBoost Immunity, which is an online campaign generated out of British Columbia, has people's personal stories about vaccine preventable diseases, talking to families about influenza and immunizing their young children. For Jude for Everyone is a parent-started organization out of Ontario. They lost one of their twin boys under 2 years old to influenza B. So it's a Canadian-based initiative. So there are quite a few online resources that are available to have those stories in our practice. We just can't give the facts and the stats and the science alone. It's not impacting, it's not making that change. It's often our recommendation, building that trusting relationship, and then having the stories about the significance and the impacts of vaccine preventable diseases that is going to make that change in that conversation. So thank you so much.
I also just wanted to say that Jessica had about 24 hours notice that she was going to be speaking tonight. Her colleague had a family crisis,
Yeah.
and so thank you so
Oh, my
much for
pleasure.
stepping in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and I should have credited her. She sent her presentation to me, and then I just, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you approach the family that wants the designer schedule? I say, okay, just what are the most important vaccines to save my child's life?
Okay, so you know what? So this is a really difficult thing because it's from like let's talk from like a liability perspective. So a family that says, you tell me which vaccines you want my child to have, right? Or like which one should I have first? Which one should I delay till later? We can always we can tell them about vaccine development. Like right now you can talk about measles and how there's an outbreak, right? But like how do we have that conversation in a way that we don't say, oh, well, there's not a lot of, your child's probably not going to get tetanus, so like delay that to later. But I feel like, okay, the encapsulated bacteria is under 2, so I really want you to get like the Hib and the Men-C and the the pneumococcal. And maybe if you said, oh, well, delay the MMR, and then there's like a measles outbreak. So one of the sections that we have on Immunize BC is around, I have a section on frequently asked questions around vaccine schedules, so that's here. And there's also a section on if you choose not to vaccinate, which has some content from the Center for Disease Control in the USA and also from the Canadian Pediatric Society. Really, this schedule section does go into why do the schedules change, how are they made, why are they getting them when they're so young, all those sorts of things. I think I would recommend having that conversation around explaining the risk like for pertussis. So like when Manesh presented around pertussis and where we see those more severe outcomes at the younger ages. I mean, I don't think you're necessarily going to go into encapsulated bacteria, but explaining how these bacteria, that's why we're giving it now, because their immune system under 2 isn't able to recommend and respond and fight it off. I feel like we're actually in an ethical dilemma because
But can you really equate the risk of MMR to Men-C?
Yes.
Where,
Oh, and so that's the thing. So if we say to the parents, you pick, they have absolutely no like background or necessarily vaccine preventable disease or like perception of risk. So we actually do have that piece of knowledge, depending on the healthcare professional, the extent of what they have. So like right now, we don't have a recommendation of how to prioritize it, but I do think that it is something that has been discussed and thought about, I know at BCCDC, and is there some considerations or parameters that we could consider putting in the manual to provide some guidance around having those discussions? Because right now, basically if I was immunizing today and you came to me with your child and they're like, I only want 2 vaccines today, I'd go through the informed consent, talk about the diseases, and then if they said to me, tell me which 2 to get today, I would say, I recommend you get all 4. And they're like, well, I'm only getting 2. Then
the nurse would not feel comfortable to say pedicel and pneumococcal.
Yes, yeah. So and I think
I thought it would.
yeah, I mean, so it's really challenging because nurses how we're able to immunize without a doctor's order is because we follow the BC CDC immunization manual as our DST, and then we have to be competent. But it's a really hard. This has come up quite a bit. Yes, Monica?
Last comment.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm on here. Last comment from Monica, and I know that this has gone on for days and days with this discussion. So, press your white thing.
Yeah.
Is that at the bottom of it?
It's red.
Okay, that means you're
Yeah.
on.
Okay.
Maybe I need to get closer to it. We've had this conversation for quite a few years, and I've been quite, because I find that every time I speak at a family doctor CME event, they come up to me afterwards and they ask me this exact question. I've got a mother who's willing to vaccinate, but she doesn't want all of the vaccines at once. I would tend to do a risk stratification. I would never defer pertussis, ever. But, Men's-C, well, we've had one Men's-C case in a person under 25 in the last decade. So I'm not particularly worried. It's usually
you're going to die.
no. But I've had let's call it pushback from the nursing profession on this, because for the nurses, they need to follow the guideline, and they feel that exactly what Jessica has explained here. So I would be really interested in the sense from the physicians in the room. Do you think this is a conversation worth having? We don't want to recommend Bob Evans' immunization schedule,
No.
but right?
Dr. Bob's alternative schedule. Avoid that.
It's almost like it decreases their cognitive dissonance if you give them a sort of a bit of a sense of control.
Yes.
And it gets them on side.
Yes. And then once they have the confidence that the child isn't going to keel over,
Slow.
then you can proceed. Yes.
So I know Laura said that was the last comment, but I think.
Okay, the second last comment.
So I think that
Did you press your button?
I have, but it's frustrating because Monica's still.
Oh, sorry. What do I do?
Touch
it again?
No, press the white plastic thing. Yeah, okay. No, okay. So I think, I normally would have that conversation, and I would go through them, and to me, in my head, it's a risk in terms of just the incidence, but also there's a severity issue, and I think this is where maybe my approach is a little bit different as someone who's got a pediatrician who's in the hospital seeing these kids. The severity to me plays a significant role in that, not just the incidence. And so I think, something like if it's the encapsulated bacteria, for me, pneumococcal would be way above Men's-C or Hib because of that risk of disease cases. But often, I find actually, often if not most of the time, no, just for the encapsulated bacteria. But pertussis, again, it's sort of an age-dependent thing. I think, clearly for an infant, whatever. And if they've got a newborn baby in the house, that conversation is slightly different to if it's an adolescent. But I think that often, I would say probably most of the time, parents do then express an opinion